This is the story of a long journey in the novel The Lone Wanderer. Daniel had a long way to go. The hardships of life awaited him on his difficult path and a clear destiny. His playful love for God was sweet. He tenderly embraced his beloved. The only destiny prepared for the two of them, unfortunately, was as prickly as a needle. The young lady jumped out of bed in surprise. She was very glad that she was accepted. The young lady happily ran around the room. She did not know whether she was dreaming or, in reality, she was accepted into the company that she really wanted to join. She thought with a joyful smile that she needed to quickly tell everyone this news. She happily called her friends and told them that she had been accepted to the job she really wanted to get. She had lost count of how many times she had applied for her dream job. She went to many interviews, but unfortunately all were unsuccessful. The young lady knew that she was very young and had her whole life ahead of her. For a moment she frowned and looked intently at the young man who stood in the distance. She looked at him intently without taking her eyes off him. She was amazed because he was very handsome, as she did not expect such a thing. She thought for a moment and felt embarrassed because he looked like a young man from a novel. She understood that it would be a sin not to fall in love with such a guy at first sight. She was surprised because she did not understand where he was looking with a serious expression on his face. But a moment later she turned around and froze in place. She was in shock and could not move as she saw a car rushing towards her at full speed. She sighed heavily as her whole body ached through the veil of darkness. She heard some sounds. She wondered if she would really die like this. Opening her eyes, she dimly saw the maids in front of her who were calling her. Moments later, she came to her senses after hearing the maids calling her Princess Clara. The maids with admiring smiles told the young lady that she looked the most beautiful in the world. She froze for a moment because she did not understand who was in front of her. She was a little puzzled because she saw that she was standing in a beautiful dress. She knew that she had been hit by a car. She said that she wanted to look in the mirror. A moment later, the maid smiled and moved the mirror closer to the princess. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She saw a beautiful appearance, silver hair, and purple eyes. The maid looked at the princess in surprise and asked if there was something she didn't like. The young lady froze in shock for a moment. She did not understand why she looked like Clara from the novel. With the speed of lightning, she ran to the window. The maids were alarmed by such behavior of the princess. She opened the windows wide very quickly. She couldn't believe that it was all true. She froze in place for a moment because when she looked out into the street, she saw a crowd of people. She was in shock because she understood that now there was no doubt that she had entered the world of a novel. She didn't understand why she had reincarnated into a novel. She understood that her life was over and she didn't even get to her favorite job. She did not understand why she had transformed into a princess. The maid said that His Majesty would arrive soon and she needed to hurry. The princess was shocked because she did not expect to hear something like this. For a moment, she froze in place from shock. The maids looked at the princess in bewilderment. She was in shock. She could not believe what was happening. People said the tyrant was coming back, but they also said he was the greatest king of all time. Sometime later, they saw the king clearly in front of them. They shouted and praised him and wished him long life. All those present continued to chant and greet the king. People looked in surprise at the man who was riding behind the king. They were alarmed and said that if he returned it meant hard times would begin, and they also believed that he brought the defeated soldier. The young lady in turn stood and looked intently at the king. He slowly walked up to her. The young lady stood quietly, not knowing what to do. The king came closer to her and said with a gentle smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady, without raising her gaze to the king, said that everything was exactly so. He looked at her closely and said that even from a distance it was obvious that she had been crying. He asked if she really hated him that much. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not so. She wondered how she could not cry in her situation. She knew perfectly well that soon he himself would kill her on the guillotine. She understood perfectly well that she would soon be sentenced to death. The young lady glanced sideways at the man the king had brought. She looked at him angrily as she knew perfectly well that everything would happen because of him. A moment later, he raised his head and looked at the princess intently. She was shocked. The young lady did not expect him to be so handsome. She turned her embarrassed gaze away from the young men, and the king looked at the young princess with bewilderment. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something had happened. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She was in shock because she knew her heart was beating very loudly. She knew she needed to calm down and not fall in love with the young prince at all. The soldier screamed furiously that Clara had betrayed the king and helped the enemy prince escape. He screamed that she could only atone for her sin by death. The young lady screamed to herself that it was just a dream. She was in shock because she knew she had read too much, but if she could concentrate, she would wake up. She was in shock because she saw people shouting that she needed to be killed. She shouted to herself that she was not a princess at all, but an ordinary reader. The young lady was confused and scared. She just wanted to wake up. Sometime later, she finally managed to wake up and she screamed. With lightning speed, she sat up on the bed and breathed heavily. She looked around as she didn't understand where she was, but a moment later, she sighed heavily as she realized it was a dream, but still her head hurt. She looked in the mirror with tears in her eyes because she understood that she was now living in a novel, and she had also become Clara. She was puzzled because she didn't know how she was supposed to survive in this world. She understood that it was even worse than the real world. The maid looked at her mistress with a gentle smile and called her. The maid smiled and asked the princess if she would visit Prince Daniel first. As always, Clara was puzzled and did not understand why she should do this. But a moment later, she remembered what happened yesterday. The king screamed furiously and called for the princess. He wanted her to wake up already. The king looked at the princess with anger and asked why she was so red. He did not understand what she was thinking. The king looked sideways at the young prince. He did not understand why she was behaving this way. A moment later, he said that the prince could be considered an honored guest of their country. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he left all hospitality to her. Clara looked at the king in surprise. She asked the king in bewilderment if he was really leaving the prince to her. The king sighed heavily and asked what was the point. He asked if she really couldn't handle it. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but suddenly some memories came flooding back to her. She knew that the reason Clara fell in love with the prince in the first place was because it was the king who brought the two of them together in the first place. She understood perfectly well that for her own survival, she needed to distance herself from Daniel and get closer to Bastion. The young lady knew perfectly well that she had to answer something quickly. She sighed heavily and said that she would do everything. He looked at her closely and asked if she was sure she could handle it. She sighed heavily and said that she could handle it, and he could leave the matter to her. The king looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she was sure she could handle it. She was surprised and did not understand his reaction, because he himself asked her. She was really Clara. She was afraid of him. The king sighed heavily and said that she was very confident and he hoped that she could handle it. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that he would watch her do it. The young lady was taken aback for a moment as his expression suddenly made her feel uneasy. She wondered if she should refuse, but a moment later she sighed heavily, knowing it was too late to change anything. The soldiers quickly greeted the princess. She looked at them in surprise. The young lady was furious because the prince was placed in the room next to hers. The king told her that the prince was their special guest, and therefore the treatment should be special, and therefore she would not have to go far. She knew that even though he was her brother, this was too mean of him. She understood that she had no one else to rely on except her brother. The young lady knew she had to pull herself together and give it her all. She looked at the soldier intently and asked if she could come in. He smiled and said that of course she could come in. She was surprised because the room was empty. She wondered if the prince was not their special guest. The prince lay quietly in bed. He glanced sideways at the door and asked who had entered the room. A moment later he sat up and saw the princess. She was surprised and did not understand why he was still tied up. She looked at him intently and introduced herself. He sighed heavily as he saw a princess in front of him. The Prince of Forgiveness, he asked if she could help him. He said that the guards refused to help him, and that is why he is in this situation since yesterday. He looked at the young lady intently, and with a sad expression on his face said that he needed her help. A moment later, he beamed and asked her to help him again. She was in shock and did not know what to do in this situation. She understood perfectly well that she had promised herself not to approach him, but she knew she couldn't leave him in that position. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was in any pain. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he was wounded when he was caught and no one ever brought him the medicine he needed. The princess was surprised. He looked at her intently and said with an innocent smile that he was unfortunately in a little pain. She was taken aback and looked at him pitifully. She sighed heavily because she knew that she needed to pull herself together. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and said that she would call the guards at once. Sometime later, the soldier untied the prince. The young lady looked at the maids and told them to call the doctor. The maid apologized and said that unfortunately it would be difficult to do. The princess was surprised and did not understand what was so difficult about it. The maid hesitated, and a few minutes later said that it was the king's order. The maid said that royal doctors are only for members of the royal family. The princess was shocked. She understood that her brother simply did not want to be treated by the prince. The maid was taken aback and said that this was not so, and the king had conveyed something. The young lady was shocked. She sighed heavily and said that it would have been better if he had just called the doctor instead of handing over the box of medicines. The maids apologized. The princess sighed heavily and, looking at the prince, said that she would deal with it herself, and if they could not go, the maids obeyed the princess. She slowly entered the room and, asking the prince for forgiveness, said that she would have to take care of his treatment herself. He thanked her for her efforts. The young lady glanced sideways at the prince and asked where it hurt. He was taken aback for a moment, not knowing what to say. A moment later, Daniel undressed and showed her where it hurt. The young lady froze in shock when she saw Daniel's naked body. A moment later, he said that he had enough scratches on his back too. The princess turned around with lightning speed. He came closer to her and called out to her with bewilderment. She froze in embarrassment on the spot because she knew that this was too dangerous. Clara understood that if this continued, she would definitely be executed. She was in shock and didn't know what to do in this situation. She thought she could control herself, but looking at the prince, she knew she couldn't do it. She was in shock as her heart was beating hard. She sighed as she realized that if things went like this, she would definitely end up like a real princess. The prince came closer to her and, pulling her by the shoulder, called her. She was taken aback and looked at him. Daniel looked at her intently and said that she had forgotten about the treatment. She turned around in a hurry, but unfortunately she stepped on the hem of her dress and began to fall. With lightning speed, the prince caught her and pulled her towards him. He looked at her closely and asked if she was okay. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at the prince, said that she was fine. She was embarrassed because he was too close. A few minutes later, the prince involuntarily made sounds, his wounds making themselves felt. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had accidentally touched his wounds. She looked at him closely as she saw that he looked very pale. She wondered if she could help him cope with the pain. In a hurry, she shouted that she would start disinfecting right away. She looked at him with a pitiful look and said that he should sit down. He smiled and thanked her for her help. The young lady looked at him closely and asked if his wounds hurt much. He sighed heavily and said that he was fine and could bear the pain. She looked at him closely as she knew the wounds didn't look very good. Clara wanted to do everything she could. She slowly began to treat his wounds and he writhed in pain. At this point, the young lady was taken aback and asked him to be patient for a little while. She sighed heavily as she understood that she still shouldn't have taken on his treatment from behind. She looked at him with embarrassment as she heard the sounds he was making. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew she had to pull herself together. After all, he was just a patient. She touched him tenderly and said that the bleeding had already stopped. Daniel told the princess that he was conscious and had not slept for a long time, so he did not feel very well. The young lady was taken aback and said that she would finish everything quickly right now and he would be able to rest. A moment later, the prince cried out in unbearable pain. The young lady looked at the prince with tears in her eyes and asked him for forgiveness as she wanted to do everything faster. He smiled and said that he was fine. Sometime later, the prince was sleeping peacefully in bed. The princess sighed heavily. She knew that she would never become a doctor. A moment later, she turned around as she heard someone calling her. The maid slowly approached the princess and said that the king was calling her to him. Clara was a little surprised as she did not expect the king to call her to him. She followed the maid slowly, but still wondered why he called her. She knew that the relationship between them was not very good. The young lady was confused and did not understand why he needed such a meeting. She froze in place for a moment as she was led to the purple living room. The man told the king that a princess had come to see him. The king sighed heavily, and while drinking tea told the man to call the princess. The young lady slowly entered the living room and greeted the king. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was standing for. He said that she could sit down already. The young lady looked at the king intently because he seemed strange to her. The king looked at the princess and asked how the prince was. Clara said that she had finished his treatment and he had fallen asleep. The king sighed heavily and said that the disinfectant was very strong and it must have hurt like hell. The young lady was shocked because she realized that the king did it on purpose. She looked at him with fury and wondered if he really was such a tyrant. She knew that he had made the sick man feel even more pain. She sighed as she understood that he was just a petty man. She asked if they should send a doctor to the prince after all. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he would do this. Clara said that she did not understand this and was worried that the prince would get worse. The king sighed heavily and said that he had nothing to do with the prince. She was in shock, did not understand what was wrong with him. She didn't understand why he was acting this way towards her. She understood that if things continued like this, she would die not because of Daniel, but because of the king. She said that he should think about her words since they needed to take good care of the principles he would not return back to the empire. The king looked at his sister with fury and shouted that he was not going to return it at all. The young lady in turn girded herself not knowing what to answer. She looked at him intently and asked if he had not stolen the prince for a special purpose. The king sighed heavily and said that he had not thought about it at all. The princess asked what would happen if he did run away to his homeland. The king looked at his sister with cold fury and said that the prince could not do without someone's help. He asked if she really intended to help him. He came closer to her and asked her angrily if she really wanted to release the prince. The young lady sighed heavily. She was already very tired of this. She told the king that she thought it was a sensible idea. She looked at the king intently and said that since he was not going to let the prince go, the matter was settled. The king asked in surprise if that was all. The princess looked closely at her brother and said that the emperor would soon wake up. The king looked at her in surprise and asked where she got that from. The young lady said that the emperor was sick but not dead, and according to her books, he would wake up in a year. She said that the emperor would start looking for the prince. She asked if that was enough to treat him with respect. The king was puzzled. She said that they could ask for land or something else as ransom, because the emperor doted on the prince and he would agree. The king smiled and said that this was a very good idea. The young lady knew that the main character would now live as a prisoner. She smiled and thought that it didn't matter to her, and the main thing was that she herself would be alive and well next to her brother. The king looked at the young lady intently without answering her. A moment later he called her, looking at her with an intent gaze. He thought for a moment and said that it seemed like he had eaten something wrong, but it was as if she had become a different person. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. She stared at him for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She wondered if she was acting that strange. She wondered if it was because of her first day. She didn't understand where she had gone wrong. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew she had to quickly pull herself together and answer. Looking at the king, she said that she no longer wanted to live like before. She looked intently at the king and said that he himself knew what her place was in the palace. It wasn't just that Clara was unhappy because of her relationship with her tyrant brother. She was also under pressure from society, and it was unbearably hard for her. She looked at her brother closely and said that it might be too late, but she really wanted to change or at least try. The young lady looked at our brother with a smile on his face, and he didn't answer. He was surprised that she smiled at him. The king sighed heavily and said that he understood her. He looked at his sister intently and said that he agreed and she could treat the prince well. The young lady was very happy about this and thanked her brother with a smile. She was very glad that the king fulfilled her first wish. She was glad that everything turned out so well because she was very worried. She was glad that her brother was more accommodating than she thought. She knew that she only had a few months left to look after the prince. For a moment she was taken aback as she saw that the maid did not even greet her. The maid looked at her friend. She was puzzled, did not understand what they should do because they did not even greet the princess. Her friend said that the princess wouldn't do anything because she didn't even look like a princess and they shouldn't respect her. The maid screamed that the princess was just the maid's daughter. Her young lady considered for a moment whether it was right to ignore their conversation. Of course, she knew perfectly well that Clara was not of pure blood, but still such an attitude was unacceptable. She knew they owed her an apology. Everyone said that she was from a lower class, and they were sorry that all the other members of the royal family died, and the king saved only her. They said that if she died, no one would care about her. The young lady was furious she was not going to live like this anymore, and turn a blind eye to such things. She knew that she had to survive no matter what. She knew that from now on, she was Clara, and she had to deal with all the urgent matters. The young lady slowly entered the room and called the prince. He looked intently at the young lady and called her. She froze for a moment in surprise as she saw that he seemed to be feeling better, but he was still pale. She was worried and asked how he was feeling. He sighed heavily and said that he was a little bored being in the room all the time. He looked at her and asked if the doctor had come to see him at her request. She sighed heavily and said that it was true. He thanked her with a beaming smile for removing the ropes. She was taken aback and sheepishly said that he didn't need to thank her, as it was a natural gesture in this situation. The prince looked pitifully at the princess and said that he would like to go outside. He looked at her sideways and asked if it was possible. She stood frozen in place, wondering why he was shining so brightly. She wondered if he had a halo over his head. The prince slowly approached the princess and called her. She froze in place for a moment in embarrassment as he came too close to her. He looked at her intently and said that unfortunately he could not look out of the window because it was too high. He looked at her with a beaming smile and said that one day he would like to look at the blooming garden with her. The young lady in turn was taken aback. She did not know what his words meant. He smiled and said that if she didn't mind, of course they could go for a walk together. She looked at him intently as she almost agreed, but a moment later she shouted that this was not possible. He smiled and sighed heavily, saying that it didn't seem to work. She was surprised as he was already about to run away. The prince, with a beaming smile, said that she could take him with her to the king. Clara wondered if he had always had such a character. Clara looked at the prince intently but did not answer him. She sighed heavily as she understood that this was all very dangerous because she almost lost her head when she saw the smile on his face. She knew she had to get the better of her emotions quickly because they would be meeting often. A moment later, she saw in front of her the maid who had recently behaved not very well with her. The maid turned around with lightning speed and walked in the other direction. Clara was furious because she saw that the maid again pretended not to see her. Clara shouted to stop the maid. Clara looked closely at the maid and asked if she understood correctly that she was the duchess's maid. The maid said that she was correct. The princess was furious and did not understand why she ignored her. The maid looked at her rudely and said that she did not ignore her at all. A moment later, the maid looked at her with contempt, and changing her expression, she said that she was glad to meet the princess, but she had a lot of work. She looked at the princess intently and asked if she could leave. Clara was furious, looking at the maid. She asked if this was a greeting. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard someone ask what was going on. The maid looked at her mistress with a radiant smile and quickly ran up to her. The duchess in turn greeted the princess. The maid looked at the princess with mockery. The duchess looked at the princess with a grin and asked if she had any problems with her maid. The young lady looked closely at the duchess as she was a candidate for the role of the future queen. Duchess Martina Alba looked at the princess with a fierce grin. Martina looked at the princess closely and asked if there was something wrong with her maid. Clara said that the maid ignored her and did not greet her. Martina asked with a grin if that was really the case. The duchess looked at the princess with a grin and said that this simply could not be. She said that her maid was quite well-mannered and it was unlikely that she could have done it on purpose. Clara asked furiously if she really thought that she had lied. The duchess was taken aback for a moment as she did not expect such a thing from the princess. Clara knew that the duchess was quite a powerful and selfish person in the novel and openly ignored Princess Clara. The duchess looked sideways at her maid and asked if it was true that she had ignored the princess. The maid was taken aback and said that it was not so. She began to justify herself. The duchess looked at the princess with a grin and said that she thought it was understandable. The duchess smiled and said that she was now going to a very important and urgent meeting, and she thought they could close their eyes to the situation quickly. The duchess was furious. It really irritated her. She knew that she would have to tell the king about everything so that he would punish the princess. Clara looked at the Duchess with fury and said that the meeting could wait. She came closer to the Duchess and said that they hadn't spoken to her for a long time. Martina was shocked, as she didn't expect this. She looked at the princess with fury and contempt and called her. Martina shouted angrily at the princess to tell her what she wanted from her, and she would leave quickly. The young lady in turn was taken aback, as she did not expect this from the Duchess. A moment later, the princess shouted at the Duchess to punish the maid for ignoring her presence. The Duchess looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she thought it was too much, since the princess wanted to punish the maid for such a mistake. The princess said that it was no mistake, as the Duchess herself had given a good slap to the woman who had spilled water on her dress. Clara looked at the Duchess and told her to do the same for her, because her maid was ignoring the princess and lying. The maid was taken aback, looking at her mistress. She said that this was not so. But a moment later, Martina slapped her maid in the face with fury. Martina looked closely at the princess and said that her maid had really done something wrong this time. She looked at the princess with disdain and asked if she had had enough now, or if she should hit the maid again. The maid, with tears in her eyes, begged her mistress for mercy. She screamed that it would not happen again. Clara, in turn, looked at them intently. The Duchess looked at the princess with a haughty grin because she saw her sad face. She knew that the princess could only express herself in words, but in life she would not hurt a mosquito. Martina looked closely at the princess. She understood that she did not need to think about such things and worry about such a trifle. Clara looked at the Duchess and said that this was not enough. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. Clara looked at them with fury and said that she was still waiting for her apology. She came closer to the maid and told her to think with her own head. If she had acted in a similar way with the king, then he would not have been so lenient in her place. She came closer to the maid and took her face in her hand. The maid shuddered, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady looked at the maid with an innocent expression and said that the king would have ordered her useless eyes to be cut out. The maid and the Duchess froze in shock. They did not expect this from the princess at all. The Duchess looked at the princess with fury and asked why she was trying to involve the king in such a situation. The princess smiled and said that they were still brother and sister, and therefore similar. She looked at the maid intently and said that if they wanted, she would do it right now. The maid, trembling with fear, asked her mistress not to do this. The princess shouted furiously, which seemed to have not reached the maid. Clara shouted that the maid should apologize to her and not to her mistress. Trembling with fear, the maid asked the princess for forgiveness. She said that she had committed a great sin by not greeting her. Martina was shocked and called out to the princess in anger. The princess glanced sideways at the Duchess and told the maid to continue, and she would tell her when she had had enough. Clara looked at the Duchess intently and said that there always comes a time to pay for your mistakes. The Duchess was taken aback by the shock. Sometime later, the maid fell to the ground with a crash. The princess looked at them intently and said that was enough. The maid, trembling with fear, bursting into tears, asked the princess for forgiveness. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had been in a very bad mood, but now she felt much better. She said that she hoped they had learned their lesson and that the maid would be polite in the future. As she left, she looked at the Duchess with a grin and said goodbye to her. The Duchess in turn looked intently after the princess. She was shocked by everything that was happening. A moment later, the Duchess gave her maid an angry push and told her to get up at once. Martina was furious. She did not understand how the princess dared to treat her like that. She wanted to show her her true place. She thought for a moment that she needed to kill the princess as soon as possible. She looked into the distance with a grin because she knew that now the princess needed to be more careful. She was already anticipating the moment when she would be disgraced in front of everyone. The princess in turn walked back to the palace pleased, but a moment later she froze in place and her mood evaporated. She thought that she would feel better, but unfortunately she felt somehow uneasy at heart. She thought that the maid was in great pain. She sighed heavily because she knew that unfortunately this was the only option. She knew that she couldn't feel safe if she didn't have anyone by her side. She was puzzled and did not understand why she felt this way. She knew that being a minor character was very lonely. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand why she was crying. She knew that she should not do this because she wanted to be happy. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place in surprise as she saw the king. He looked at her intently, asked what was wrong with her. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not expect to see him. She could not utter a word. A moment later, she turned around and, wiping away her tears, said that she was fine. She sighed heavily and said that it looked like she just had dust in her eyes. She asked if he had really gone out for a walk. The king looked at his sister with fury as he understood that something had happened. He remembered her saying that she wanted to change before it was too late. He said that he went out for a walk and also asked the princess if she had seen the prince. She consoled him and said that she had. The young lady looked at her brother and said that the prince had asked permission to go outside. The king cried out in anger and asked what she was talking about. The princess flinched as she did not expect such a reaction. The king did not understand who the prince thought he was. The king asked if they were just servants to the prince. He shouted that they should teach him a lesson. Clara looked at her brother intently and said that she understood you, and she would convey his words to the prince. The king in turn shouted at his sister to be rude to the prince and they should show him his place. The young lady agreed with him. The young lady sighed heavily and glanced sideways at her brother. She understood that he was very difficult. She was not at all in the mood as she had recently had a skirmish with the duchess and now reproaches from the king's brother. She sighed heavily as she understood that it was hard to be a princess. The maids looked at them intently and greeted them. She sighed heavily, knowing that no one was ignoring her when she was with her brother. For a moment she felt sad about this. The king saw her sad expression. He looked closely at his sister and asked if she was going to the victory banquet. With the speed of lightning, her face changed, and with a smile she said that this time she would take part. He sighed heavily and said that this was the right decision. She asked if he would like to go as her partner. The king looked at her in surprise as he did not expect such a thing. She was taken aback and asked the king for forgiveness. She said that apparently he didn't like the idea. He sighed heavily and asked if he had heard correctly. He asked his sister if she was sure she was not sick as she was behaving very strangely. He looked closely at his sister and asked if something had happened while he was gone. The king was a little puzzled and wary. He did not understand why she was trying to get closer to him. The young lady in turn wondered if she had gone too far. She knew that the real princess was afraid of the king, so they were not close and avoided each other. She smiled and said that she was perfectly fine, and on the contrary, he seemed very tired to her. She asked if he hadn't had enough sleep. The king sighed heavily and said that it was true, since after the war he had problems with sleep. She thought for a moment as she remembered that in the story he was constantly having insomnia. She wondered if that was why he was always angry. She looked at her brother closely and asked how he was doing with his nap. He sighed heavily and said that he had trouble sleeping. He looked at his sister intently and asked if she hadn't heard that he had insomnia. She took his hand and said that he should just come with her to the bench. The king was shocked. He did not expect this, but the young lady took his hand with a smile and pulled him along with her. She said he should try now because it was a safe place and there was no war. He said he couldn't sleep on the bench because he didn't even have a pillow. With lightning speed, the young lady pulled him towards her. The king was surprised. He did not understand what she was doing. She smiled and laid him on her lap and asked him softly if this would suit him. She smiled and said that he should be comfortable now. He looked at his sister in surprise as he did not expect to see such a smile from her. A moment later he sighed heavily and said that it was not bad at all. He looked intently at his sister and told her that she should sing him a lullaby. She looked at the king in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that it would calm him down. He looked intently at his sister. She sighed heavily because she knew that in her past life you had stepped on her ear. She looked at her brother intently because she knew that if it would help him, then she would do it. A moment later, the young lady finally collected her thoughts and began to sing. The king at the same time enjoyed her singing and quietly fell asleep. She was a little puzzled and didn't know how long she had to sing to the king. A few minutes later, she looked at her brother in surprise. Clara looked at him closely and asked him quietly if he was sleeping. She was surprised that he fell asleep so quickly. She looked closely at her brother as she saw that he looked very cute when he was sleeping. She knew he was the most brutal tyrant in the novel, the man who had taken hundreds of lives. She understood perfectly well that unfortunately, he was her older brother. She was shocked and did not understand why he killed all his brothers and left only Clara alive. She sighed heavily, and looking at the king said to herself that the princess he knew was no longer with him. She hoped that he would help her change. She wanted them to forget the past and finally accept each other. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the closed door. She knew that yesterday had been a difficult day and a lot had happened. She knew that from that day on she had to be always calm and focused because in 6 months the Emperor would wake up and everything would end. Clara knew that after waking up he would definitely help the prince, and even the king could not ignore the Emperor. She knew that then the prince would return to his homeland safe and sound. Leading him into the room, she told the prince that she had brought him the book he had asked for. She came closer to the bed as she noticed that the prince was sleeping quietly. Clara sighed heavily. She did not understand why he was so handsome. She said that Clara was very poor, and now she understood why she helped him escape. The prince got out of bed with a smile on his face. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect that he was not asleep. He looked at her with a smile and said that he didn't even know that the princess herself would give him such a compliment. She was shocked and flushed with embarrassment. She didn't understand why he didn't say he was awake. He smiled and said that he was awakened by the creaking of the door, and now he sleeps a lot since he has nothing to do at all. He said with a smile that perhaps he should have continued pretending to be asleep. The young lady was in shock. She realized that she had simply disappeared. She wondered if he had really heard absolutely everything. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he really hoped he hadn't heard something he shouldn't have. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand how she could now look the prince in the eyes. She looked at the prince intently and said puzzled that it was not so. She smiled and said that he didn't have to worry about it at all. A moment later, she showed him the book he had asked her to bring him last time. She said she would leave the book and go away. The prince looked at the princess intently and called her. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was covering her face. She sighed heavily because after such a disgrace she didn't want him to see her at all. He asked if she was leaving already. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry because she was the only one he could talk to. He looked at her intently, asked if they could talk before she left. She asked in surprise what he wanted to talk about. Daniel looked at her intently and said that he would like to talk about, for example, the Empire. She looked at him in surprise. The young lady apologized and said that unfortunately there was no news from the Empire. He smiled and said that they could talk about the news of Verona. The prince looked at the young lady and said that she herself had told him that he was an honored guest in the kingdom. He asked if there were no receptions for honored guests. She said that a victory banquet would be held very soon. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She wondered if he was asking her to take him with her to the banquet. He sighed heavily and asked with a smile if it really wouldn't work. Carla sighed heavily and said that it was true because she had already said that it was the king's order. He looked at her closely and said with a soft smile that she was very stubborn. As she left, she asked for forgiveness with a smile because there was nothing she could do about it. Carla knew that she needed to get out of the room as soon as possible. He looked closely after her and said with a smile that everything was fine because the main thing was not to give up. She was taken aback and froze for a moment. He said with an innocent smile that he had already said before that he wanted to go for a walk with her one day. The prince looked at the princess intently and with a smile said that he would constantly ask her about this until he succeeded. Daniel smiled and said that she hoped so, she didn't mind. She turned around and said that she didn't mind. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that he needed at least some freedom, but she couldn't go for a walk with the prince of a country at odds with them. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that in that case he was very happy Daniel, and asked if he could now be a little more persistent. The young lady was surprised. She did not understand how he could smile like that, looking into her eyes when she told him about the banquet in honor of their victory. He looked at her intently and said that now he would ask her to go for a walk with him every day. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He smiled and asked if he could always be with her. Then the young lady was taken aback and looking at him with a surprised look, said that this was also impossible. She sighed heavily and said that he was scaring her too much with his proposals. She sighed heavily and said that in that case she would go. The prince jumped out of bed with lightning speed and reached for the princess. He was taken aback and called her. She sighed heavily and said that no matter what he said, she would not stay. He sighed heavily and thanked her for the book. The prince, breathing heavily, said that he was truly happy every time she came. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him intently. He sighed heavily and asked her to come to him tomorrow. Looking into the distance, he said that he would like to talk to her a little. The young lady was amazed. She could not understand how the prince could bow his head so easily to someone. She sighed heavily and said goodbye to him, but agreed. She was a little confused and didn't know what to do next. The next day, the young lady came to the prince, and they had a fun time reading. After reading for a long time, the princess looked at the prince with a sweet smile, said that she had to go now as she needed to prepare properly. The prince sighed heavily as he realized that the reception was organized today. He looked closely at the young princess and said that he wanted to stay with her a little longer. He sighed heavily and said that it was a pity that she was leaving. He smiled and said that she should tell him tomorrow how the banquet went. He looked at the princess with a beaming smile and wished her a good time. She smiled and thanked the prince, and a moment later she left his company. The maid looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that she seemed to be in a good mood, and it seemed that she had really been looking forward to the banquet for a long time. The young lady in turn knew that everything was exactly like this because she had already really settled into her new place, and her relationship with the prince was developing very well. She knew that even though he was the main character of her favorite novel, there was still a lot she didn't know about him. She understood perfectly well that since it had happened that she was now living in a novel, she hoped that she would be able to learn more about him. She was interested in what he would look like when she saw the main character. The maid smiled and asked her mistress if she liked the yellow dress. The princess said with a smile that it was very beautiful. The maid looked intently at her mistress and cried out that she must wear a red dress. The maid was taken aback and looking at her friend said that it did not really suit the style of the mistress. The maid was alarmed and said that the dress was simply luxurious and she should definitely wear it. The maid shouted to the mistress that she absolutely had to wear it to the reception. Her friend was surprised and did not understand why she was screaming like that right in front of the lady. The maid looked at her subordinate intently and told her not to interfere. The young lady in turn looked at her intently as she knew that she was one of the senior maids. The lady saw that she had quite a strong character. She looked closely at the maids and said that any outfit would suit her. The young lady sighed heavily as she looked at the maid, as she saw something that made her upset, but she just didn't want the head maid to be angry with her later. The young lady looked closely at the outfit. She noticed that it was unusual and she had never worn anything like it before. She looked closely at the dress as she knew that it would go well with the princess's appearance. Sometime later, the young lady was showing off her beautiful outfit in front of the mirror. The maid smiled and looking at the princess said that she was beautiful in any outfit. The young lady looked closely at her reflection and noticed that the outfit was a little revealing. The maid smiled and told the princess that she was the most beautiful. The princess looked at the maid in surprise because she herself had recently said that she was not her style. The princess sighed heavily because she knew that the novel said that Sarah was very honest and never lied. She knew that having such a person near her was worth a lot. The princess looked at the maid intently and said with a smile that she really liked her honesty. The maid froze for a moment in embarrassment. The man looked at the princess intently and said that the king was still preparing, so he asked her to wait a little. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why she was called before the banquet had even begun. She wondered if the king had really agreed to accompany her. She sighed heavily as she knew that it was simply impossible since he was not that kind of person. She was puzzled as she did not know why he had called her. For a moment she froze and wondered if this was all because of the duchess. She wondered if he had found out about their recent quarrel. The man looked closely at the young princess and said that she could come in. She sighed heavily and frowning entered the king's room. She bowed and greeted the king according to the rules of etiquette. He looked at her with a smile as she entered the room. He looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that she herself had recently offered to become her date for the banquet. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of expression she had on her face. She was shocked because she realized that he had not called her because of the duchess. She wondered if he really wanted to accompany her to the banquet. The young lady thanked the king with a satisfied smile. He smiled and said that everything was fine because he did not want her to appear there alone, because aristocrats are very picky. The young man looked at the king intently and said that the duchess was asking to come in. The king looked at the young man in surprise as he did not understand why she had come to him, but he sighed heavily and he told his subordinate to call her. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at the king intently. She realized that he still did not know what had happened between her and the duchess. She thought for a moment that she should pretend that nothing had happened. The duchess walked slowly into the room. She sighed heavily and said that it would turn out that she was in the way. The young men froze in shock on the spot, looking at the duchess. For a moment there was a dead silence in the room. No one said a word. The young lady in turn was in shock. She stared at the duchess, who was watching them with a grin. The king hesitated, not knowing what to answer to this situation. A moment later he came to his senses and screamed in rage. He could not understand how such a thing could happen. The king looked intently at the lovely ladies who were ready to tear each other apart. The duchess looked at the young princess with a smile and said that this outfit was the latest trend of the season. She looked closely at the princess and said that this was a very interesting coincidence. The king said angrily that this was already a problem. He looked closely at his sister and asked how this could have happened. The princess hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She remembered the maid shouting at her to make sure she wore that dress. The princess was shocked. She simply could not believe such a thing. She knew that the maid served her and did not understand why she needed such a thing. The duchess looked at the princess with a smile and said that she did not need to worry at all, as there was nothing wrong with loving fashion. She smiled and said that although their outfits were the same, they were not the same, so this could be the highlight of the evening. The king looked at his sister and asked if she really wasn't going to change her clothes. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked why she should do that. He asked, puzzled, if he really had to say it out loud. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was angry only at her. She knew that she could also be beautiful in such a dress. She looked closely at the king and said that it was not a problem for her and they could go. The princess looked intently at the duchess. She in turn hoped that she was wrong, but she understood perfectly well that most likely the duchess had set it all up. She looked at the duchess with fury, for she knew that she would certainly deal with her after the banquet. A moment later, all the guests were informed that the king had arrived. All the guests present were surprised. They wondered who was next to the king. They looked intently at the king and his companion and wondered if this could be Princess Clara. The aristocrats were surprised and did not understand why they were together today, as this had never happened before. The young lady looked at everyone present intently, as she could see that everyone was truly in shock. She looked closely at the king, wondering what he was thinking about now. A moment later, everyone started whispering they were surprised because they noticed that the princess and the duchess were wearing the same dress. The duchess in turn greeted everyone present with a radiant smile. The aristocrats in turn pitied the duchess. They said that the duchess seemed offended that the princess was wearing the same dress as her. The young lady in turn quickly released the king and, bowing, thanked him for accompanying her. Trembling with anger, she said that she would go. The king in turn looked after his sister intently and with surprise. The young ladies were discussing the princess. They didn't understand what was happening to her now, and they also said that the dress didn't suit her. Clara was angry. She wanted to get rid of stress by eating. She was furious and didn't understand why in this situation everyone considered her guilty. She devoured the food with fury. She wondered if they thought she would break because of this. The king glanced sideways at his sister. He sighed heavily as he hoped that she would chew the food and not swallow it whole. The man looked at the king and asked him with a smile if he had tried the oysters he had sent him. The king looked at his sister in bewilderment and asked the man what he had said. The man looked at the king and said that they had been specially selected for the king and that they were the best in the whole kingdom. The king looked at the minister with fury and said that it seemed that his memory was poor since he hated seafood. The king asked angrily if they hadn't already had a similar situation just recently. The king sighed heavily and told the minister that he had previously told him not to do such nonsense and to miss him. He said that they should just do their job. The king angrily ordered the guards to take the minister out. The man was shocked and called for the king. The young lady looked at the man closely. She knew he was unlucky today. She wondered if her brother had gotten out of bed on the wrong side again. The young lady glanced sideways at her brother and noticed that he was looking intently at her. A moment later, she looked at him with a smile. The king froze in shock as he did not expect such a thing from his sister. The king looked closely at his sister and heard someone whispering. Those present said that the princess had done this on purpose out of envy of the beloved duchess. The king looked at his assistant with fury and told him to call the duchess immediately. The duchess beamed with happiness. She was very surprised that the king had called her, but at the same time she was glad. Those present whispered that the king had called the duchess to him. They said that he must see his future wife in her. The aristocrats were glad that the king had finally accepted the love of the duchess. Martina looked at the king with a smile and asked if he had called her. The king coldly answered her that it was true. He looked at her with fury and asked if she could go and change into another dress. The duchess froze for a moment in surprise. She looked at him in bewilderment. The king said that everything was correct since they had similar dresses. Martina was taken aback and said that she had put it on especially for the banquet. The king looked at the young lady with cold fury and anger and asked what was wrong with that. He came closer to her and angrily asked if she really meant to say that she would not change her clothes. The young lady in turn almost choked on her food when she heard the scream. She realized that she was now facing a big problem. With the speed of lightning, she ran to her brother and told him that everything was okay. She looked at her brother intently and wondered if these were the eyes of a man who was in love. She was shocked. She didn't understand why they would even fight over a measly dress. She wondered if he was so angry about this situation all the time. The princess looked at her brother intently and said that she really thought the duchess looked splendid. The princess said with a smile that the duchess had a special charm. The king looked at the princess in bewilderment. He looked at her angrily and asked what charm he was talking about. She was at a loss. She didn't understand why he repeated it several times. The young lady slowly bowed to her brother and asked him to calm down a little so that the banquet could proceed smoothly. She smiled and said that she was completely fine. He sighed heavily and agreed with her. Everyone present froze in surprise. The young lady in turn thanked her brother. Everyone was amazed as they had no idea that the king was so pliable. The duchess in turn froze in shock on the spot. She had not expected anything like this at all. The princess in turn slowly decided to leave them. The duchess ran after the princess and asked her to stop. The duchess bowed slowly and thanked the princess. She said that she really liked the dress, and if it weren't for the princess, she would have been in an awkward situation. The princess sighed heavily and quickly turned around to leave. The duchess looked closely at the young princess and said that the king was apparently not in a good mood today. Usually he was very kind and sweet to her. The princess was taken aback for a moment. She did not understand what was happening and wondered why the duchess had suddenly become so friendly. The princess understood perfectly well that her hatred towards her could not evaporate so quickly. The duchess in turn, trembling with rage, clenched her fists behind her back. A moment later, the young lady decided to leave the company of the duchess. A waiter passed between them carrying glasses in his hands. The duchess looked intently at the young man. She put her foot out and he accidentally stumbled. The duchess looked at the young man with a grin as he fell. Unfortunately, when he fell, he accidentally dropped all the glasses of wine. Trembling with fear, he asked for forgiveness as he accidentally shaved the princess's dress. He looked at the princess in fear and cried out that he had committed an irreparable sin. Martina looked at the young man with fury and shouted at the guards to take him out immediately. The young man was very scared and begged for mercy. She looked at the princess and asked if she was okay, and if she was hurt anywhere. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was okay. Martina looked closely at the princess and said with regret that her dress was dirty. The princess looked closely at her ruined outfit and said that she would just change, but suddenly she realized what had actually just happened. Clara looked intently at the duchess, who was glowing with happiness. The rest looked at Martina and said that it seemed she had completely lost her fear. The waiter was shocked. He screamed and swore that he didn't do it on purpose. The princess glanced sideways at the waiter and told the guards to wait. She sighed heavily and told the guards to leave the waiters alone. The man, trembling with fear, thanked the princess for saving him. Martina looked at the princess with fury and said that the waiter had spilled a drink on her and he should be severely punished. The princess looked at the duchess and asked if she hadn't tripped him. Martina looked at the princess in surprise and, asking for forgiveness, asked what she had just said. Clara looked intently at the duchess and told her not to act like a fool since it was her fault. For a moment, there was a dead silence between them. The Duchess looked at the princess with tears in her eyes and asked if she really hated her that much. She looked at the waiter and said it was as clear as day that it was his fault. The Duchess looked sideways at the princess and asked how she could accuse her without any evidence. She said that it could harm her honor. Everyone froze in shock and began to whisper very quietly among themselves. They looked at the princess with a sharp and disapproving look. They began to say that this was too much on her part and that she was going to hell. They pitied the Duchess because they knew that the princess was openly picking on her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that they could have asked the waiter himself what happened. She was in shock, did not understand what kind of atmosphere was around. The Duchess walked slowly up to the waiter and said that that was exactly what they would do. The Duchess said that she was innocent, so she had nothing to fear. The Duchess looked at the princess with a fierce grin. She thought that she was just a stupid princess to think that she had won. She understood perfectly well that there was no one who would be on her side. The king looked at the Duchess with fury and asked how she dared to lie to him. The Duchess looked at the king in bewilderment. She did not understand why he behaved in such a way. He came closer to her with rage and asked if she would continue to pretend to be a fool. He shouted that Clara's words were absolutely true. The king shouted in fury that he had seen her trip a waiter. The Duchess looked closely after the princess and said that apparently the king was not in a good mood today since he was usually very kind to her. The king looked at the Duchess in bewilderment. He did not understand when he had been kind to her. The king watched everything that was happening closely. But a moment later, he froze in shock as he saw the Duchess trip the waiter who fell to the ground with a crash. He looked at her with fury and asked if she had really lost her fear. The Duchess was taken aback and shouted to the king that she would never do such a thing. The king asked with fury if he was lying now. The Duchess was taken aback and said that she didn't mean it that way. She said that maybe it was just an accident. He looked at her furiously and asked if she really thought it was an accident. She looked at the king in surprise and asked why he would behave like that with her. Trembling with fear, she said that she was Martina. A moment later, she shouted that she was his future bride. He came closer to her and looking into her eyes with a grin asked who said that. The king asked furiously if he had really proposed to her to become his bride. He shouted that this Anna was making up all sorts of nonsense. Bastion asked furiously if she was really mocking the royal family. The lady was taken aback. She said that it was not so, and she had always respected him. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she respected him, but he also asked if she respected his sister Clara. The young lady in turn looked at the princess with fury and contempt. Bastion furiously asked why she was silent. The king looked at the Duchess intently and asked her if she didn't know that the princess was also part of the royal family. The princess in turn looked at the king intently and called him. The king looked at his sister with fury and said that she did not need to be told that everything was all right. She sighed heavily and said that she had not intended to do that at all. She said that, unfortunately, the Duchess had not shown her due respect. She looked at the Duchess intently and said that she thought she deserved to be punished for her misdeeds. Everyone present was taken aback and stood frozen in shock. The Duchess was as surprised as all the guests. They were surprised that the princess wanted to punish the Duchess. They said that it seemed like the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and it seemed like the king and princess were both tyrants. The king looked at the Duchess intently and said that she could choose her punishment, as punishment could be carried out in 3 ways: prison, exile, or death. The Duchess was shocked. She screamed and called the king. She was puzzled and did not understand how he could treat her like this. She looked at him frightened and said that he knew perfectly well what kind of family she came from. The king shouted at her with fury. He did not understand what was wrong with him. He shouted that he was above everyone in this country. He looked at the Duchess with fury and asked if her father really considered himself to be such. He asked with fury if it was really her father who had expanded the territory of the kingdom or who ruled it. The young lady with tears in her eyes begged and pleaded with the king to spare her. He sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't be begging for forgiveness from him but from Clara. The Duchess looked at the princess with fear. She was shocked because she did not expect this. The princess sighed heavily and said that there was no need to do this because this was enough. She looked at the Duchess with fury and said that she chose exile. The king looked at the Duchess and said that it was a very good choice. The duchess was shocked. She looked at the princess and called her, but she did not answer. The king looked at the knights and told them to grab her. The duchess was taken aback and begged the king for leniency. While the guards were dragging her, she screamed and called for the king. The king in turn looked at everyone present with rage and said that from now on, anyone who dared to make any mistake towards Clara would suffer the same punishment. He shouted that she should be treated the same way as he was. All the aristocrats froze in shock on the spot. They did not expect to hear such a thing, but they still bowed as they accepted this order. The king looked at everyone present with anger, but said nothing. The princess looked at her brother and asked permission to thank him because he had helped her so much. He sighed heavily and told his sister not to worry because it wasn't just because of her. He said that he needed to maintain the authority of the royal power. The king said that if something like that happened, she should immediately inform him. He looked closely at his sister and asked if she wanted to go for a walk outside. After some time they walked in silence. The king sighed heavily and called his sister. He sighed heavily and began to talk about what happened. The young lady thanked him with a smile for what he did and said that in this world she could only rely on him. She knew that Clara from the original book hated and betrayed her brother, but now she realized something. She understood perfectly well that the king had killed only the brothers who had risen against him, but he had no intention of harming Clara. She smiled and thanked him again. The princess said that with him she could survive absolutely anything. The king was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that she should not imagine all sorts of things. He looked at his sister with embarrassment and said that he didn't do it because of her. The princess looked at him intently and said that of course she knew that. She looked at her brother with a smile because she saw that he was very cute when he was shy. She was glad that she no longer had to fight everything alone. She knew that she still had a lot of work ahead of her, but now she was very glad because she knew that from now on she would not be alone. The maid was taken aback when she entered the princess's room. She was a little surprised since she had just left, and now something incomprehensible was happening in the princess's room. She looked at the princess in surprise and called her. She was excited and did not understand what was happening. The princess looked at her intently and said that she was choosing new maids. The maid looked at her in bewilderment. The princess looked at everyone present and said that they thought everyone already knew what had happened to the duchess. She said that for this reason she wanted to find everyone who served her, as she thought they also deserved punishment. She looked closely at one of the maids and asked if anyone wanted to confess voluntarily. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She was in shock. The maid screamed that this incident with the payment was a simple accident. She asked the princess to believe her. She screamed that she was not even the duchess's maid, and she really did not know that this would happen. The young lady sighed heavily and called the maid by name. She looked at her intently and asked if this was her confession. The princess sighed heavily and said that she did not remember saying anything about her separately. The maid was taken aback and cried out that it was not her fault at all. The princess looked at the maid intently and said that if that was the case, then she had nothing to fear. She said that they would investigate and find out whether she was guilty or not. The maid was trembling with fear. She was taken aback and hesitated when the guards approached her. With tears in her eyes, she asked the princess for forgiveness. She screamed that she did as she was told. She asked the princess to give her another chance. The princess looked at everyone present and told the guards to check all the maids. She said to leave only those she could truly trust. The maid looked at the princess intently and asked if she would be checked too. Clara looked at her intently and said that she would not be checked because she knew that the maid was not hiding anything from her. She looked at Sarah intently and said that in return she had to be 100% devoted to her so that she could rely on her. The young maid looked at the princess intently. She was amazed by her kindness. She thanked the princess. She looked at the princess and said that she would definitely always be on her side. The princess was a little surprised, but still glad that it happened. She knew that Sarah was only one person on her team, but she was still glad she knew that this was just the beginning. Today she was going to the castle to recruit new maids. She wondered if she should have stopped by to see her brother. Unfortunately, she had been so busy lately that she hadn't even visited the prince. The young men saw the princess and greeted her with respect. She smiled and greeted them in return. She was surprised because it seemed strange to her that so many people had already greeted her today. The maid looked closely at the princess and with a smile invited her to go inside. The maids greeted the princess with smiles. The maid looked at the princess in surprise and asked why she had come to them. Clara looked closely at the maid and said that she had come to recruit new maids. She looked at them in surprise as she did not understand why they were so excited. The maid looked at the princess with puzzlement and asked for forgiveness, saying that it would be difficult to accomplish. Clara in turn looked at the maid with bewilderment, since she did not understand why it was so difficult to do. The maid sighed heavily and said that unfortunately no one responded to her offer. The maid looked at the princess with a frightened look and said that everyone was frightened because of yesterday. She looked at the princess intently and asked them to tell the king about this as they would think of something. The princess looked at the maids in surprise as she did not understand what had happened yesterday. She thought for a moment because she understood that they were afraid of the king, and it seemed that now they realized that someone would stand up for her. She sighed heavily as she wanted to resolve this issue in a good way. She understood that it was very good that everyone was now greeting her, but she was surprised that because of this she would not be able to find new maids. The princess in turn understood them perfectly, since many of the maids were of noble origin. She sighed heavily because she had no idea how she was going to get people on her side. Then, she sighed heavily because she knew she had to come up with something quickly. She sighed heavily, and looking at the maids, said that she understood everything, and she also said that since she had come, she would like to go to her brother. She asked if he was at home. The maids glanced sideways at each other and said that the king was in his room, but he had some kind of meeting about the budget and he was not in the best mood at the moment. The princess looked at them intently, but did not answer. The king looked at everyone present with fury and told them to repeat it again. For a moment there was dead silence in the office. No one said anything. The men looked at each other but did not understand that they were definitely finished. They hoped that they would not die today. The king looked at everyone present with anger and asked why they were silent because he had told them to repeat it. The man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The man hesitated and began talking about increasing the budget for the princess's palace where she was staying. He timidly said that they had already planned the budget, and its sudden increase without their knowledge was simply impossible. But the man hesitated, not knowing how to say the last phrase to the king. Everyone present was shocked. They wondered if he had really lost his mind to say such a thing to the king. The king looked at everyone present with fury and shouted that they must continue as he was interested in what else they were going to say. The men looked at each other in fear. They were in shock, didn't know what to do, but they didn't understand that they needed to somehow stop the king. The man smiled and said that they could increase the budget starting next year. The king looked at everyone present with anger and asked if they really didn't like his decision that much. The man was taken aback and said that they were just very surprised by him, and it was too sudden for them. His neighbor was in shock. He did not understand what he was saying and told him to calm down. The young man looked at his neighbor and asked if he himself was not interested. The man was taken aback and said that he was not interested at all. He understood that if his friend wanted to die, then let him die without him. The king looked at everyone present with cold fury and said that he had thought about it and realized that all this time he had neglected Clara, and for this reason he wanted to somehow make amends for his guilt. He looked at everyone present with anger and asked if it was really so strange. The young people unanimously said that this was not so. The young man looked intently at the king and said that he understood him perfectly and would do as he said. The man looked closely at his old friend, wondering if his comrade and brother would betray him. The king angrily asked if they had any budget problems. He shouted that they could just take the missing amount from him. He also shouted at the guards to seize the man who was against this. The man froze in shock. He didn't expect this. As he was being dragged, he screamed at the king and begged for mercy. He screamed that he had crossed the line. The king looked at the man with a smirk as he very quickly changed his mind. The man hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later the princess entered the office. He was taken aback and looked at the princess in surprise as he did not expect to see her in such a place. Everyone looked at the princess intently and surprised. The young lady was taken aback and said that it seemed she had entered the office while they were having a heated argument. She was puzzled and said that she had to come back later. She said that she would wait and they could continue. The king looked at the princess intently. He was surprised that she had visited him, but still said that she should wait outside. The king looked intently at the guard and told him to close the door. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She realized that she was mistaken because it was not enough to just order people to think one way or another. She knew what she needed, and she herself had to show something. The young lady looked closely at her brother, as she knew that it was the same with him. She knew that it was very good that they had become closer to each other, but she knew that they could not stop there. She sighed heavily as she understood that unfortunately she was now only causing losses. Clara understood that she needed to change this immediately. She wanted to change everything so that everyone would accept her. She knew perfectly well that it couldn't be any other way. The king sighed heavily as his mood had completely deteriorated. The young people tasked, but sighed as the data of the meeting turned in a completely wrong direction. They wondered whether they too would now be sent into exile. The king sighed heavily and looking at everyone present said that they could continue the meeting and also asked what was next on their agenda. The young man looked at the king with tears in his eyes because he was very scared. He looked at the king intently and said that quite a long time had passed since Prince Daniel had arrived at the castle. The king looked at the man in bewilderment and asked the prince. The man looked timidly at the king and said that many people were wondering about his condition and whether he was alive at all. He said that they had heard that the prince was living in the princess's palace, but they had never personally seen him. The young men, excited, looked at their friend. They wanted him to watch his words, since they wanted to still live. The man was taken aback and said that the prince could serve their country to improve good diplomatic relations. He said that it would be better not to keep him locked up, but to include him in the life of society outside. He was very nervous and hoped that the king would not kill him for such words. He looked at the king intently and asked in a trembling voice that he consider their proposal. The king sighed heavily as he realized that everything was apparently very bad. The man looked closely at the king and said that they all thought so. He looked hard at the king and said that it seemed appropriate. The king thought for a moment about including the prince in the life of society. He was puzzled and did not understand why he could not simply be locked in the room. The king wondered whether it was really necessary to let him out. He suddenly remembered his sister, who had said that before the prince returned to his homeland, they had better really treat him well, namely as an important guest. The king thought for a moment, for he knew that his sister had also spoken of this. He looked closely at all those present and said that he would certainly think over their words. He sighed heavily and said that that was enough for today and they could go their separate ways. The men were very glad that the king had decided to listen to them. They bowed politely. They were glad that they had also survived. A moment later, the king was taken aback as he heard his sister calling him. The king looked at his sister in surprise and asked why she was in the castle. Clara smiled and said that she had some issues to sort out with the maids. For a moment there was complete silence between them. She looked at him intently and said with an innocent smile that he looked tired. He sighed heavily as he realized that he had to somehow pretend so that she wouldn't understand what they were talking about now. The king looked at his sister and said that he simply had not gotten enough sleep and that she did not need to worry at all. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had not gotten enough sleep again. She was excited and asked when was the last time he slept normally. He sighed heavily and said that he slept normally when they were in the park, and she sang a song to him. Clara looked at the king intently and asked if he had finished all his business for the day. He looked at her in surprise and said that he had finished completely, and also asked why she asked such questions. Clara, excited, looked at the king and said that then he should go with her to the bedroom and she would try to help him sleep. The king was taken aback when she spoke about the bedroom. He asked with fury how she, a woman, could suggest such a thing without a shadow of shame on her face. He was shocked and asked his sister if she was really going to sing him a lullaby again. He shouted that she didn't need to do this at all, because he had had enough of it last time. He was in shock and didn't understand what people would think of him when they found out about this. The princess called the king in line and shouted that he needed to sleep. She said that he might get sick and get sick. The king sighed heavily and said indignantly that it was his business, not hers. He nevertheless agreed with her, and they went into the room. The young lady entered the bedroom and was amazed by its beauty, for the king's room was luxurious. He looked sideways at his sister and told her to do what she came for quickly. Clara was surprised since he was already prepared. She asked in surprise if he would be comfortable sleeping in his clothes. The king sighed heavily and said that he was fine with it. She said that he could close his eyes now. He sighed heavily and said that he would close his eyes when he felt sleepy. With lightning speed, the young lady closed the king's eyes. She said that in order for both to feel sleepy, he must first close his eyes. He sighed heavily and asked, puzzled, what she was doing. Clara apologized and said that she didn't do it on purpose. The king sighed heavily and said that he would do as she wished. The young lady looked at the king intently and asked if she should sing him a lullaby. He sighed heavily but said nothing. The young princess timidly asked if she really didn't need to do this. The king sighed heavily and asked his sister if she really thought the emperor would be able to wake up. He said that today everyone had been talking about him being nice to the prince. The young lady froze for a moment as she had not expected such a question from the king. She looked at the king and said that all his subjects did this only for the best purposes. She said that they would not gain any benefit if they treated the prince badly. The king was furious. He did not understand who was treating the prince badly. He shouted discontentedly that all they did was mess with him every day, and she herself was constantly with him and entertaining him. The princess was taken aback and told her brother to close his eyes. The king sighed heavily and said that he did not want to let the prince go at all. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately this could not be simply ignored. He was puzzled because he could not even guess that after the war he would still have many problems. The young lady looked at her brother closely. She knew that he was a tyrant by all accounts, but he was not the kind of man who would sacrifice his country and people for his own whims. She sighed heavily and thought because she sincerely wanted the king and the real princess from the book to have such a sincere conversation. She looked at the king intently and asked if he wanted her to think about it. He asked in surprise what she wanted to think about. The young lady understood perfectly well that solving the problem with the prince would help her solve her problem with the possible execution. She understood perfectly well that she needed to think about it carefully. She looked at her brother with a bright and happy expression and asked him how about having a tea party and inviting the prince there. She smiled and said that this way he would be able to go outside temporarily and they would gain a political advantage in the future. She looked at the king and said that if he was worried about it, he could come personally and check everything. The king agreed with his sister through the son. She looked at him in surprise and called out. The young lady came closer to him and asked if he was already asleep. She was surprised that he fell asleep so quickly. She looked closely at the king as she knew he had fallen asleep quickly, but she didn't understand what the problem was. She wondered if he could only fall asleep when someone was around. The young lady wondered for a moment if it had a sleeping effect on people, but a moment later she decided to throw it away, mice or not. She looked at her brother with a smile and said that, in that case, she would leave him and wished him a good night's sleep. Sometime later, the young lady returned to her room. She was deep in thought as she knew that she had to do everything perfectly so that the king would not have a single doubt. She understood perfectly well that she had to visit the prince. The prince looked at the princess with surprise but with a joyful smile and greeted her. The princess greeted him back with a smile and said that she had good news. A few days later there was a commotion in the count's house. The young lady in turn was very alarmed. She ran to her father and said that something had happened to them. The count looked at his daughter with an innocent smile and asked what had happened. She looked intently at her father and with a trembling voice said that they said there would be a tea party in the castle and she had been invited there. Cecilia screamed that Princess Clara had invited her to the castle. The count looked at his daughter in surprise and asked excitedly if she was really going to go there. The count was in shock and did not understand why everything happened so suddenly. The young lady screamed that she herself did not know what to do. The count was very excited. He did not know how much time had passed since the day the princess sent the duchess into exile. He wondered if the princess really wanted to deal with someone else. He was very puzzled because he knew that the princess had changed a lot lately. The young lady, in turn trembling with fear, asked her father what she should do. She looked intently at her father and said that unfortunately she was very much afraid of meeting the king. She was very scared and didn't know if it was true that he was as much of a tyrant as everyone said. The count looked at his daughter intently and, puzzled, said that he was also afraid of the king and therefore tried to avoid him. Cecilia was shocked by her father's words. She said that now she felt even more afraid. The count was puzzled. He did not know what to do in this situation. He was very worried about his daughter and did not understand why they were being punished like this. The prince looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she was really going to host the tea party. Clara smiled and said that it was all true. Even though she was a princess, she was not very familiar with aristocrats, so she hoped to find like-minded people. The young lady looked at the prince intently and with a radiant smile asked if he would like to go and not drink otherwise, if that was okay with him. The prince stood frozen in place for a moment in surprise. A moment later, he looked at her in surprise and asked if he could come to the tea party. With the speed of lightning, his face changed, and he beamed with joy since he finally had such an opportunity. The young lady looked at the prince intently and timidly said that, unfortunately, this was not complete freedom. Only during tea time he was allowed to go out, and she was not sure that he would be interested in purely female company. He looked at the princess and asked if the king would come. She looked at the prince intently, for she remembered that the king had looked at her with indignation and asked what he would do when he was alone with women. She sighed heavily and, looking at Daniel timidly and puzzled, told him everything that the king had told her. The prince sighed heavily and said with a smile that he understood her. Daniel, you in turn said that he would gladly accept her invitation. Daniel looked at the princess and said with a smile that he did not know why the king had changed his mind, but he wanted her to convey his gratitude to him. The princess smiled and said that they would certainly tell him about it. Daniel looked closely at the princess and asked if she was okay. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and, looking into the distance, said that he thought she was against him going out anywhere. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at the prince, said that this was not so at all because she simply needed permission. His Majesty. She smiled and said that if he agreed, then so did she. Daniel looked at the princess in surprise as he did not expect to hear something like that at all. But a moment later his face changed and he said with a smile that it was very good and he was already looking forward to her tea party. The young lady in turn looked at the prince with bewilderment as she did not understand his reaction. Sometime later she returned to her room and was immersed in her thoughts. She did not understand why he behaved in such a way. She thought about it because for a second she thought he was upset about something. She wondered if he really thought she didn't like him. Of course, she didn't try to get closer to him. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that she needed to get rid of extraneous thoughts. She was confused and knew that she just needed to focus on preparation. She remembered that she needed to send invitations to everyone. She remembered that her brother had promised to help her with the servants. The young man slowly approached her with an innocent smile, said that she was still the same, and constantly looked at the floor. The young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment. She hesitated and looked at him in surprise as she did not understand who was in front of her now. She looked at the young man with bewilderment as unfortunately she did not remember him. He said with a grin that even that stupid surprised expression on her face hadn't changed at all. He said that she was like a lost fawn in this big palace. The princess looked at the young man with anger and asked what he said. She was furious and did not understand who was in front of her now. Because of him, her mood immediately worsened. It was the first time she had seen such a fool since she had become a princess, and she wondered if he didn't know what she had done to their duchess. She looked closely at the young man and asked in surprise if he was Hugo Sapatro. He looked at her intently and mockingly called her a fool and also asked if she had forgotten his name only because he had been abroad for several years. He looked at her intently and mockingly said that she had heard about water and tea drinking, so he decided to drop in. The young lady looked at him with her fury and asked if he had just called her a name. She asked furiously if he had really gone out of his mind and forgotten that she was a princess here. Clara was furious and did not understand how he could allow himself to do such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that if it weren't for the blood, he wouldn't have said anything. He came closer to her and said mockingly that she knew that she was not a princess at all. She froze for a moment in surprise. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin why she was shaking all over. He asked if she had lost her voice. The young man said mockingly that she didn't need to cry at all. Turning around, he mockingly asked her to at least say something. He smiled and asked how many men sent her their letters. He came closer to her and mockingly asked if there was at least one aristocrat among them. The lady in turn froze in surprise. She stared at the young man with her mouth open. She was shocked by his impudence. The young lady was furious. She did not understand what was wrong with the young man because he behaved even worse than the duchess. She did not understand how a real princess could restrain herself all this time. She looked at the young man with fury and said that apparently he had not heard the latest news. The princess looked menacingly at the young man and said that she would tell him how she treats nobles who do not respect etiquette. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him with fury and asked if she really hadn't changed. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she really thought otherwise. He said mockingly that she, as always, was looking at his floor and could not utter a word in front of him even now. The princess, in turn, did not listen to him any longer. She angrily hit him in the face. The young man froze in shock. He looked at the princess in surprise as he did not expect such a thing from her. He looked at her with fury and asked how she dared to do such a thing. The princess said that she thought this was a fitting punishment for his unforgivable behavior. The young man looked at her with fury and asked if she was even aware that no one in the castle was even paying attention to her. He shouted that she was always sitting in her room. He shouted furiously that she could at least sometimes go out of the room into the street so that people would not forget what she looked like. The young lady looked at the young man intently and, with cold fury, told him to first calm down and think carefully about who was standing in front of him. She looked at him intently and said that she was the princess of this country. She told the young man that he had no right whatsoever to say such a thing in front of her. She looked at him with fury and told him to prepare himself as she would still correct his inappropriate behavior. She looked at him intently and said that she would teach him to respect people of higher status. The young man froze for a moment in surprise. He looked at her with fury and asked who she was going to teach. He did not understand what had happened to her during his absence. He shouted that they did not remember her throwing around such words before. She looked at him intently and said that Lila had already told her about it, but decided to repeat once again that the old Clara was no longer there. She looked at the fruit man intently and said that she would give him one last chance. She said that he should quietly leave right now and should never be seen again. Clara sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, asked if he too should be sent into exile. He screamed and called the princess. He looked at her with fury and screamed that he was simply driving her crazy. He did not understand what was happening to her. He asked if she really wanted to scare him. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked where she got the courage to send anyone into exile. He was furious because she had raised her hand against him and was now threatening him. He looked at the princess intently and said with fury that he would definitely report everything to the king, but a moment later they heard the king himself. He was outraged and did not understand what was happening. The king, in turn, ran towards them with fury at full speed. The young man beamed with happiness and, looking at the king, said that he had come just in time. Looking at the king, he said indignantly that he should have seen that the princess had just hit him. With lightning speed, the king grabbed the young man by the clothes. The youth froze in place from shock. The king looked at the young man with fury and asked if he was really tired of living. He did not understand how he dared to open his mouth at all. The young man was shocked. He did not understand why the king was behaving this way. The man ran up to the king with the speed of lightning and asked him to let him go. He looked at the princess intently and offered his deepest apologies. The young lady looked closely at the young man. She recognized that he was Hugo's cousin, the Marquis of Zapatro. Hugo shouted to the king that the princess slapped him first, and it was true. Hugo in turn looked at his brother in bewilderment, since he did not understand why his brother was apologizing. The king was furious. With the speed of lightning, he raised his fist over the young man's face. The king struck Hugo in the face with all his fury, and he fell to the ground with a crash. Everyone present froze in shock, and the Marquis called out to his brother in confusion. Bastion looked at the young man with fury and asked if he himself had not heard what he had said to Clara. The king looked at the Marquis with fury and asked him if he thought that his brother had crossed all boundaries. The Marquis hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Hugo walked up to his brother and called him in a plaintive voice. The Marquis quickly bowed to the king and asked for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and, trembling with fear, said that unfortunately his brother was still very young and did not always distinguish the limits of what was permitted. The Marquis said that they thought his brother did not do it on purpose. The princess looked at the young man and asked if he was not her age. She told the Marquis that his brother was already old and not a child. She looked at them intently and said with an innocent smile that she didn't think his age could justify his behavior. The Marquis was taken aback. He did not expect such a thing. He asked the princess to forgive Hugo for this mistake. The Marquis said that his brother would immediately apologize to her. The princess looked at everyone present and said that she always forgave such pranks, but did not know how much longer she could continue to do so. She looked at them and said that this was not the first time he had gone to hell, and she did not think that an apology could make up for such a misdeed. The king looked at his sister with fury and asked what she had just said. The king kicked the man in anger and shouted that he was the last piece of trash. He asked Hugo if he really wanted to die. Bastion shouted at the young man that it looked like he needed to be sent straight to the block. The king was furious. He shouted that his sister was too kind. He was furious and said that for such people, even the death penalty was a light form of punishment. The young man was taken aback and looking at the king asked him to wait a little. He shouted to the king that he had an important matter, and he asked the king to listen to him and believe him. The king looked at him with fury and asked what he was talking about. He shouted that it was just nonsense. The young man hesitated and began to mumble something. She heard that he began to talk about her. Clara looked at her brother and asked for a minute of attention in order to listen to Hugo. The king looked at his sister with anger and surprise and asked why she was defending him now. The Marquis approached his brother and asked how he felt. He did not have time to answer. The king looked at the young man with fury and told him to say what he wanted quickly. The Marquis looked at his brother and asked him to tell them all the truth. Hugo looked at the princess intently and with tears in his eyes said that he actually liked the princess very much. Clara froze in shock on the spot. Hugo shouted that he did it because he liked the princess very much. Everyone froze in shock. They just couldn't believe what they had just heard. Hugo sighed heavily and said that he just wanted to seem cool and daring to her. He looked at the princess intently and begged for mercy, asking her to remain friends. He shouted that in the future he intended to take the princess as his wife. Clara froze in shock. The Marquis was shocked. He called his brother Hugo, shouted that it was true and he loved the princess very much. The king in turn did not tolerate this. He angrily struck the young man again. The king in turn went mad with rage and anger. He shouted at the guards to immediately seize the young man. With lightning speed, the guards carried out the king's order. Hugo shouted and called for the princess. The king was burning with rage and anger. He shouted that he would certainly kill the young man. The young lady looked at the king with a smile on her face and asked him to calm down a little. The king was shocked. He did not understand how she could calm him down because that madman wanted to marry her. She smiled and said that she could simply refuse him. She looked at the king intently and asked why he was here now. The king sighed heavily and said that he came to see the palace with the officials because of a budget problem. He was shocked because he witnessed such a situation. The king shouted furiously that she should not even think about getting married. She sighed heavily and wondered if she would have to be alone all her life now. She looked at the king intently and with an innocent smile said that he did not need to worry at all because she would only be dating a good man. She sighed heavily because at that time she did not know what rumors would spread about her because of this incident. The king looked intently at his sister and shouted that he would certainly find her a groom himself. The young people stood at a distance and watched the king intently. They felt sorry for the princess. The king shouted furiously that she should not marry a man like Hugo and that her fiancé should be at least a little like himself. She sighed heavily, knowing that she couldn't stand someone like Bastion, but a moment later she agreed with him with a smile. Sometime later, everyone was discussing the incident that happened in the palace. The young man looked at his friend intently and asked with a smile if he had heard the latest news. The prince was sitting quietly in his room when suddenly he heard some noise outside the door. He came closer to the door and began to eavesdrop on the guards' conversation. They were surprised and said that this news was simply wonderful. But they were discussing the fact that the king was very angry at that moment. The man smiled and said that it didn't matter because the main thing was that their princess was proposed to. The prince froze in shock when he heard about the proposal. The maid looked closely at her mistress and congratulated her with a joyful smile. The princess looked at the maids in bewilderment as she did not understand what they were talking about. The maid smiled and, looking at her mistress, said that she had received a public confession of love, and this was very excellent. The maid was glad that all this happened in front of His Majesty. She said that she was very envious of the princess because there was no one so brave anywhere. The young lady was shocked. She looked closely at the maid and asked what was going on. Sarah looked at the princess in bewilderment and asked if she wasn't marrying the Marquise's younger brother. The princess was shocked. She did not understand why they were suddenly talking about something like this. With lightning speed, the young lady pounced on the maid and asked who had told her such a thing and why she thought the princess was getting married. The maid was frightened as she did not expect such behavior from the princess. She trembling said that everyone was talking about nothing else in the castle. Sarah was taken aback and said that even their new maids had talked about it. The maids looked at each other and said that some of the aristocrats said that they personally saw how she was proposed to, and they heard a lot about it from others. Young Lydia froze in shock. She didn't understand what was happening. She was shocked and did not understand where such rumors came from. She understood that, of course, there were a lot of people there, but a wedding was too much. Sarah looked at the princess intently and asked with a smile if she didn't want to get married because the king wanted to kill her fiancé. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it wasn't that. The maids looked at the princess and said that she was incredibly kind. The maid smiled and told the princess that there were rumors that she personally came to the king and asked him not to kill her fiancé. Clara was shocked. She looked at the maid and asked how other people could know what she and her brother talked about in private. The maid smiled and said that Mayor Case cried like that when they wanted to kill his brother. Sarah smiled and said that someone had heard the king shouting while practicing on the drill ground. She looked at the princess and said that he was probably there too now. The king was furious. He did not understand how that world had frozen dared to steal his sister. He screamed that he should have killed the bastard. Then, the king screamed with fury and took out his anger on the mannequin. The princess was surprised and puzzled. She simply asked her brother not to kill the young man. She did not understand where such rumors came from. She knew that Hugo had already been sent into exile. She was surprised and did not understand what her brother was doing. Now she saw that he was burning with anger and fury. The maid looked intently at the princess and asked if she really was not in love with the young man. Clara looked closely at the new maids and asked if they could stop talking nonsense already. She was angry and hoped that they would already get down to their actual work. She looked at them intently, holding herself in check, and asked if they wanted to get to work since today was your penance. The maids were taken aback and said that they would do everything now. They were very scared because it was the first time they had seen her so angry. They thought that most likely she really liked the Marquise. The young lady sighed heavily. She didn't want to pay attention to it anymore. She knew that the most important thing now was to focus on the holiday. She sighed heavily and said that she needed to move forward and not pay attention to such things. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that the suit suited him very well. She was very glad that the suit fit him perfectly. Daniel looked at the princess and with a radiant smile thanked her. Daniel looked at the maid with a smile and also thanked her. The maid looked at the prince intently and said, "It looks like he will fall in love with all the young ladies of the night drinking." The princess looked at the maid with an innocent and puzzled smile and asked her to calm down. The princess smiled and said that everyone was already waiting for them in the garden. She told the prince that it was time for them to go. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was his first appearance since he came to them, and it was very exciting. Some time later, he still hesitantly left his room. Daniel sighed heavily and said that he was already looking forward to the moment of tea drinking. The princess looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that she would have a lot of fun if she started singing, and she promised him this. The prince in turn slowly followed his companion. He looked at her intently and called out. Daniel looked at her intently and asked if she was getting married soon. The young lady was astonished. She looked at the prince intently and asked irritably where he managed to hear that. The prince looked at the young lady in bewilderment and said that someone behind the door said that, and he heard it. She looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that this would not happen. She was shocked because the rumors were already spread everywhere. Looking at the prince, she said excitedly that the young man was not at all her type, and he also said a lot of nasty things to her. Daniel looked closely at the princess and asked what kind of men she liked. The princess thought for a moment, as she had never asked herself such a question before. She was surprised and did not know what to answer. But a moment later she said that she liked caring men and good looks. The maid looked at the prince with a smile and said that her description matched the prince's characteristics. The princess in turn looked at them with bewilderment. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and said that it seemed to be him. The princess sighed heavily because she saw that he was of course very self-confident. She looked closely at the prince as she saw that he was truly handsome and very polite to her. Clara sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She looked away from him in embarrassment and, turning around, said that they were already expected and they needed to hurry. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. He sighed heavily and said that he somehow felt sad. Clara was puzzled. She didn't understand why she suddenly blushed. She knew that she couldn't let him see her like this. She knew that she didn't need any misunderstandings at all. Some time later, the young ladies gathered in the garden for tea. They were excited because they did not know whether to come or not. The lady looked at her friend and said that they had hardly communicated with the princess. She did not understand why the princess suddenly changed so much and decided to establish communication. A moment later, one lady saw the princess in the distance. They froze when they saw the new princess accompanied by a handsome young man. Clara sighed heavily as she knew that now it would begin. She looked at everyone present and thanked them for accepting her invitation. She smiled and said that she was very glad to see so many beautiful ladies here. She looked at everyone present and said that she really hoped that they could all become friends. She asked them to make themselves at home. Clara looked at them intently and said with a radiant smile that they could start drinking tea already. Some time later, the king watched them closely from afar. The young lady froze for a moment after the princess's words. She didn't know how she should behave. The count looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes and asked if she could say that she was ill and would not be able to come to the event. He said that she could say that someone had died and she had to go to the funeral. The young lady was shocked and did not understand how she could lie about such a thing. The count tenderly embraced his daughter. He was very worried that she could die. The young lady was taken aback and told her father not to worry. The count looked closely at his daughter and said that she must certainly return home alive. She looked at her father with a smile and said that of course she would. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at everyone present. She knew that she couldn't relax. She knew that people had to do this for their father and the honor of their family. She was very glad that the king did not come to this event. She looked at the princess intently because it seemed to her that the princess had changed very much. The young lady looked at the princess and thanked her with a smile for the invitation. She smiled and said that she had been engaged this fall. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she knew nothing about it at all. Clara looked at the young lady and said that it was very strange, but she didn't even receive an invitation. The young lady was taken aback. She didn't know what to answer. The princess looked at the lady and asked if she had not called her on purpose. The young lady shuddered, not knowing how to answer the question asked. The princess looked at the young lady intently and asked in bewilderment why she had even brought up the subject. The lady was taken aback and, bowing, asked the princess for forgiveness. The young ladies began to whisper among themselves. They noticed that the princess had changed very much and even her look had become more menacing. Clara knew perfectly well that she had several tasks for this event. Firstly, she had to show herself. She knew they had to understand that she as a princess could no longer be disregarded, and she also really wanted to make friends or at least find people close to her soul. She hoped that among all those present, there would be at least one such person. She really hoped that her tea party would go exactly as she planned. The young lady looked into the distance and smiled and told all her friends to look away. In turn, the prince sat and quietly enjoyed the wonderful tea. Everyone was embarrassed and did not know who was in front of them now. The young lady slowly walked up to the prince and greeted him shyly. She apologized for the sudden greeting, but she wanted to say that he was very handsome. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and thanked her for the compliment. The young ladies quickly ran up to the prince and asked who he was there with, and they also wondered if he would like to have tea with them. The prince was taken aback and laughed. He asked for forgiveness. Daniel unfortunately did not have time to finish his sentence when suddenly someone called him. He turned around as he heard the princess's voice and looked at her with a radiant smile. Everyone was in shock. The lovely ladies looked at the prince intently. They looked at him in surprise as they wondered if he was really that same Prince Daniel. They were shocked and also froze in embarrassment because they thought he was very handsome. The young ladies looked intently at the prince and princess, who were chatting away from everyone. Clara looked closely at the prince and asked with a smile how he was enjoying his tea party. He smiled and said that it was a very good event and everything was very good because everyone was very friendly. He smiled and said that it seemed like she had a lot of friends here. She looked at everyone present in surprise. The young lady smiled and said that it was not so, because unfortunately her social skills were not very good, and it was a little difficult for her to get along with people. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked who she would like to be friends with. Clara thought for a moment, wondering who she would like to befriend today. She looked closely at all the ladies present and wondered which of them she could trust. Clara really wanted her friend to be polite and friendly, but she froze for a moment as she saw a girl sitting quietly at the table in the distance. She looked at the young, beautiful lady in surprise. Cecilia sighed heavily. She was puzzled as it was difficult for her to be at this reception. She did not know anyone and wanted to return home as soon as possible. The young lady slowly approached her with a smile, asked her forgiveness, and asked if she would like to share a conversation with her. Cecilia rose up with lightning speed and froze in place. She was surprised because she did not expect to see the princess herself. She was taken aback and asked the princess in surprise why she had approached her. The princess looked at the girl in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady was taken aback and asked the princess for forgiveness. She said that she was just a little confused. That's why she asked such a question. The young lady was amazed. She did not understand why the princess spoke to her because she wanted to sit quietly and go home. She understood that now, unfortunately, this was simply impossible. A moment later, the prince came up to them and said with a smile that they could sit down. The princess smiled and thanked the prince. The girls quickly ran up to the princess and asked if she would allow them to join them. They said with smiles that they would like to sit next to the prince. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled and excited. She did not understand why more and more people were gathering behind her chair. She was surprised that the princess decided to talk to her, and the prince was also with her. The young lady looked closely at everyone present. She understood that the prince was extremely popular among the ladies. But the young lady was a little upset and angry since it was she who organized this tea party, but now no one even pays attention to her. She sighed heavily as this was beginning to irritate and upset her. The princess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that this was their first meeting. She smiled and said that they could get acquainted, and also asked the girl what family she was from. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the princess trembling. She looked closely at the princess and introduced herself. Cecilia said her name and what family she was from. The princess looked at the young lady with her gentle smile and asked why she was sitting alone. The young lady hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She was puzzled and did not know what answer to tell the princess. After all, she just wanted to sit quietly, alone. She wondered if she should say that she was not sociable and had no friends. She thought for a moment, not even knowing how to present this information. The princess looked at the young lady as she realized that she was very shy. Some time later, the king came up to them. He looked at them intently and said that it seemed that quite a lot of gusti had come to them. The prince turned around and looked intently at the king, and the princess in turn shuddered as she did not expect to see the king at the event. The king looked closely at everyone present and said with a sly smile that this would be very interesting. The young ladies in turn tensed up and began to whisper quietly among themselves. The princess was taken aback and looking at the king said that she thought he would not come. The king smiled and said that he decided to drop in on them. He smiled and said that she could go about her business and he would settle in here himself. The young lady froze in shock. She was amazed that the king had come to them because she was very afraid of the king. The king looked menacingly at the prince and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and also asked if he was really enjoying the freedom he had given him. The prince looked at the king intently, and with a satisfied smile said that he was very happy that he could go out even for such a short time, and he also thanked the king generously. The king in turn looked at the prince with anger as he considered him to be very impudent. He angrily pushed the prince away sharply and said that he would also participate. The prince looked at the king in surprise and said that he had sat down in his place. The king angrily said that he did not see anything terrible in this. The king looked at the prince intently and asked if there was any problem with that. He told the prince that he could sit in any other seat. The prince looked at the king in surprise and said that of course he could sit on the other one. The king in turn looked at Daniel with fury and he quickly moved. The king looked at his sister and told her to sit down too. He looked at her angrily and asked if she was really going to continue looking down on him. She smiled and said that of course it wasn't so. Clara was surprised she didn't understand what was wrong with her brother. She looked closely at everyone present as she saw that he had frightened all the ladies. A moment later, the prince sat down next to the princess and looked at her with a smile. The king was furious that the prince had managed to sit next to his sister again. He looked angrily at the prince and said that there were many free seats at the table. He did not understand why he was sitting here next to his sister again. The prince looked at the king in bewilderment and asked if he couldn't sit next to the princess. The prince smiled and told the king that he could sit next to him if he really wanted to. The king was furious. He didn't understand who had allowed the prince to sit next to him. Daniel smiled and told the king that he himself wanted him to move, which meant that he needed to sit next to the king so that he wouldn't sit all alone. The king shouted angrily that it did not matter and that he should move to another seat. The princess looked timidly at the king and asked him to calm down a little as there was enough room for everyone. The king was furious. He shouted that he did not like it at all. The prince smiled and said that in that case he would stay in his place. The princess smiled and said that today was a very nice day and they could just have a quiet talk. The young ladies were worried. They did not know what to do because it was easy for them to communicate with the prince. But now the king had come and they were afraid of him. He frightened them very much. The princess looked at all the ladies present in surprise. She did not understand why they had suddenly all left. Sometime later they were left alone. She sighed heavily. The princess was a little puzzled, because even though they were so happy about the prince's presence, they were now trying to escape as quickly as possible. The young lady in turn looked closely at the princess as she saw that she was frowning. She was puzzled because it seemed to her that even the princess had become sad because of the king's arrival, and she didn't know what to do. The king looked closely at his sister and asked what they had talked about before he arrived. She smiled and said that she had just met the lady, and they had struck up a conversation. The king looked at his sister in surprise and said that it was quite unexpected that she was interested in other ladies. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her name. Cecilia was taken aback and trembling with fear gave her name. The king looked at the young lady and said that it was the first time he had seen the earl's child. He looked at her and said that apparently she was not as timid as he was and was not going to hide from him. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not so. She sighed heavily because he did not know how scared she was now. She was shocked because she had to meet the tyrant king himself in person. He was her worst nightmare in life. The king looked closely at the young lady and with a gentle smile said that he thought she was quite a conscientious lady. He looked at his sister and said that she had a very good choice. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that in that case they could get to know each other better. The young lady was surprised and did not expect that the princess would want to communicate with her further. Trembling with fear, she said that she simply did not understand why the princess decided to communicate with her. The young lady timidly said that it was truly a great honor for her. She thanked the princess for inviting her to this event. Trembling with fear, she said that she still had a lot to learn, and she did not know if she would be suitable as a friend to the princess. Clara looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this was the first time she had made a friend herself. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they could get to know each other little by little. The young lady was trembling with fear. She did not know what to answer. She wondered if they could become friends. The princess did not hear an answer from the young lady when suddenly someone in the distance screamed. Everyone turned around tensely, looking to the side. The king looked to the side. He did not understand what had happened. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise. She did not understand what she was doing. The young lady in turn waved her hands excitedly. She was anxiously driving away a bee. With lightning speed, all the ladies present scattered as the bee headed straight towards them. The king sighed heavily. He was surprised that they were so afraid of the little bee. The princess was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening and what kind of day it was today. She was very angry because the bee made the atmosphere at the tea party even worse. The princess screamed and asked everyone present to calm down. The young lady looked at the princess with concern and said that she should have been more careful because the forehead flew towards them. The princess in turn looked around warily. The king shouted furiously to everyone present to pull themselves together. The king was furious. He shouted that if they were so afraid of her, then he would take care of it himself. He wanted them to stop screaming and squealing and also to rush around. He shouted that if they did not calm down, then he would certainly send them into exile. He shouted that this bee was very small and could not be seen at all. The young lady sighed heavily. She was in shock and did not know how she could hold out until the end. A moment later, the waiter brought the young lady a piece of cake. She froze in shock as there was a bee on the small piece of cake. She looked at her closely, knowing she had to control herself. The king was furious. He did not understand where the bee was. He wanted to find it as quickly as possible. But a moment later, he noticed that the young lady was holding a piece of cake in her hand, and on the cake was a bee. He shouted angrily at the young lady to stop, and the young lady in turn involuntarily flinched and screamed as she did not expect to hear the king. Unfortunately, the young lady stumbled because she was very scared. She dropped a piece of cake from her hands, but the king managed to catch the young lady and she did not fall to the ground. The king stood still for a moment in surprise as he had a piece of cake on his head and a bee was flying around him. The young lady stood still in shock. She didn't know what to do. The princess was shocked. She did not expect to see anything like this at all. She looked at everyone present with bewilderment and said that this was simply a terrible tea party. The king looked at the young lady intently and asked if she hated him. Everyone present froze in shock. The king looked at the young lady and said that if that was so, she could have said it in words. He did not understand why it was necessary to do so. The young lady looked at the king intently. She was trembling with fear and said that she did not do it on purpose. She remembered her father who asked her to come home alive. She mentally asked her father for forgiveness because she understood that she had let him down. With the speed of lightning, she sat down on the ground and asked the king for forgiveness. The king looked intently at the young lady and laughed wildly in front of everyone. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that he himself did not understand why, but this was a very funny situation. The princess quickly ran up to the king and called him. A moment later, the princess called to the servants to bring a towel, as the king needed to be dried and escorted back. She looked at her brother closely and, reaching for his head, said that his face was all dirty and his clothes too. She sighed heavily and said that she thought he should go and change his clothes. The king looked at her closely, and taking her hand, he said that he was all right. She looked at him intently, because she knew she didn't care whether he was okay or not. She wanted him to leave already, and then her tea party would be saved. She looked at the king intently, and said that he needed to at least change his clothes. He smiled, and as he left, he said that he would do so. As he left, he called the young lady. Cecilia looked after the king with excitement. The king glanced sideways at the young lady and said that he remembered what happened today. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he was leaving already. The princess looked closely at her brother. She did not understand what he meant. She wondered if he was going to take revenge. A moment later, the young lady still lost her footing and fell to the ground with a crash. The princess ran up to the lady with lightning speed and asked if she was okay. The young lady was in shock. She was breathing heavily and bursting into tears as she understood that she would definitely die now. She looked at the princess intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that she would like to leave early. Clara looked at the lady closely and said with a smile that she understood everything. She asked the young lady not to take the king's words to heart. She was glad that her brother did nothing to the young lady, but she did not understand why he did so. The young ladies bowed to the princess and said that it was time for them to leave too. A moment later, the rest of the ladies followed them. The princess was surprised and did not understand why they were doing this. She looked at everyone present in surprise and wondered if they were all going to leave now. A few minutes later, she was left alone with herself. She was in shock and did not expect at all that her plan would fail so miserably. Of course, she guessed that there would be certain difficulties, but she did not expect that everything would end in such a failure. She was furious because unfortunately she had failed even in such a small task as tea drinking. The prince looked closely at the princess and called her. Daniel slowly walked closer to the princess and asked if she was okay. He was a little worried as she had been preparing for this day for a very long time. She looked at the prince intently as she was upset, as this was his first time out since arriving in the kingdom. She knew that he must be very sad that everything ended so quickly. She sighed heavily because she thought that the first pancake is always lumpy. With lightning speed, she pulled on a beautiful mask with a smile, and looking at the prince said that everything was fine. She sighed heavily as she knew that next time she would definitely be much better prepared. She knew that she had to make sure that the king did not come to such events. She looked at the maid and asked her to move. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked if he would like to take a little walk, since that was the case. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was, of course, very glad that he had finally met the king. He looked closely at the young princess and said that he was very upset that he was not able to talk normally with the king. The young lady, in turn, timidly said that the king came to them unexpectedly, and unfortunately everything turned out that way. Daniel smiled and said that he even hoped to personally ask the king for permission to leave the castle, since he did not want to burden the princess anymore. Daniel said with a smile that he really hoped that he could do it. He smiled shyly and said that he was very sorry that nothing had worked out for him today. Daniel sighed and said that he didn't even know if today was his last day of freedom. The princess looked closely at the prince. She saw that he had not given up. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that she really wanted the tea drinking to go well, but in the end she couldn't help him in any way. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The princess smiled and said that of course she was holding the tea party primarily for herself, but her brother also invited the prince so that the people who were worried about his condition could see that he was fine and calm down. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if the king was really worried about him. The princess looked at the prince with a timid smile and said that everything was exactly like that, but she asked him not to tell anyone about it. She smiled and said that it would be their secret. She looked at the prince intently and said that he did not need to worry because he would still have a chance to go out. Clara said that they only needed the king's consent. The prince thought for a moment and said that he was, of course, glad. She looked at him intently and said that her brother often had mood swings, so he would probably get angry if the prince kept asking for permission to go out. Daniel sighed heavily and said that he understood that. He looked at the princess with a frown, but a moment later, his face changed, and he said that he really hoped that with her help, he would be able to somehow make friends even with the king. The young lady in turn looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that at all. She sighed heavily because she understood that this was simply impossible. She knew that they were sworn enemies in the novel. She sighed heavily and said that she thought it would be quite difficult. Daniel smiled and said that he found it hard to imagine too. They continued walking slowly, smiling, but suddenly the king approached them. He looked closely after them and said that he wanted to return quickly before the end of tea. He sighed heavily because he knew that unfortunately all the guests had already left. He looked closely at his sister and the prince, as he did not understand why the two of them were walking together and cooing like sponges. The young lady entered her brother's room and greeted him with a gentle smile. The king sighed heavily and said that he had left the tea party earlier than everyone else yesterday. He looked closely at his sister and asked how everything had gone after that. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. The young lady was a little puzzled. She didn't know what to say. She smiled and said that everything went well, although they finished quite quickly. A moment later, he rose up with lightning speed and told his sister that he would paint her portrait that day. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise, as she already had one portrait. The king sighed heavily and said that he was already out of date, and he even invited an artist. A moment later, a man entered their office and told the king that the artist had already arrived to them. The king was surprised that he arrived so quickly, but still told the knight to call the artist. The man entered the office and greeted the princess and the king. The princess looked at the man with a smile and thanked him for coming. The man sighed heavily and said that it was a great honor for him to paint her. The king looked at the man with fury and shouted for someone to put all their soul into the painting, otherwise he would rip it out of his body. The man shuddered and shouted that he would do everything possible. The princess was shocked. She did not understand why the king was doing this. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting on a chair and posing. The king looked angrily at the man and shouted at him to try harder. The man sighed heavily and said that he would certainly try his best. Clara was a little puzzled and didn't understand why he was standing next to her. The man looked at the princess and tenderly asked her to look straight ahead. She was taken aback and agreed. Suddenly, the king was overcome with memories of days gone by. He glanced sideways at his sister and called her. He looked closely at his sister and asked if she felt anything for Hugo. The young lady was taken aback. She jumped up from her chair and, looking at her brother, asked why he had suddenly started talking about the young man. The man looked at the princess with bewilderment and asked her not to move. She was taken aback and asked the artist for forgiveness. The princess sighed heavily and said that she didn't like him at all. She didn't understand why the king was suddenly talking about him again. She sighed heavily and said that she just wanted to forget about the young man as soon as possible. The king sighed heavily and said that there were still rumors that they were in love with each other. He looked at her intently and asked, "What about the prince?" She looked at the king in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. Bastion looked closely at his sister and asked if she liked the prince. She looked at him with fury and shouted what he was even talking about. She did not understand why he suddenly decided that she liked the prince. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was suddenly reacting so strongly. She sighed heavily as she understood that he suspected her of something. Clara sighed heavily and said that she did not understand at all how he could have such a thought, since the prince was practically their prisoner. The king looked at his sister with fury and asked why she was then evading the answer. He shouted and wanted to hear from her whether she liked him or not. The princess screamed furiously that she didn't like him and would never like him again, and that would never happen. She knew perfectly well that if she fell in love with him, she would die. The king was taken aback. He looked at her intently and said that he understood. He was surprised and did not understand why she was screaming like that. He froze in place in surprise, not knowing what to answer. At the same time, the young lady sat down quietly and began to pose further. The king glanced sideways at his sister as her reaction made her look even more suspicious. He looked at the artist and asked if he was finished. He approached the artist and said that he would like to look at the work. Clara looked at her brother in surprise and said that little time had passed and the artist had not finished yet. The king came closer to the man and told him to show his work. The man sighed heavily and told the king that he had not finished the work yet. The king was furious. He looked at the artist and asked if he really called this work. He shouted that there was not a drop of soul in the painting. The king was furious. He shouted at the artist because he promised to paint a masterpiece. The man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The king angrily asked the man if this was really his strategy. The man hesitated and, trembling with fear, asked the king for forgiveness. Clara looked at them intently and said with a smile that she would like to see it too. The man sighed heavily and looked at the princess with tears in his eyes and asked her not to move. The young lady smiled and said that she liked the picture very much because it was cute. The king was puzzled. He said that there was nothing cute about it, and it was simply awful. The princess smiled and said that the painting was indeed beautiful. She looked closely at her brother and asked if he simply thought it was more beautiful than it actually was. The man sighed heavily and thanked the mental princess. The king was furious. He shouted that this was complete nonsense and that there was no soul in the painting. The princess looked closely at the artist and with a gentle smile said that she liked everything and asked the man to continue. She asked her brother to calm down a little. She hoped that he would calm down and stop making scandals out of nothing. The king sighed heavily and said that she called him brother too often. He asked if she really thought he liked being called that way. The young lady looked after him with a smile, as she was sure that he liked everything. A moment later, she sat down in her seat and, looking at the artist, said that he could continue. After a while, the man looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that everything was ready. Clara looked at the painting in surprise. She was very happy because it turned out even better than in life. She smiled and, looking at the man, said that he needed to be rewarded well. The king sighed heavily. He said that he didn't even know because he didn't like it. Looking at the man, he said that if his sister was happy, then so be it. He told the man that he could go free and he would be rewarded later. Trembling with fear, the man thanked the king. The king looked closely at his sister as he noticed that she really liked the painting. He sighed heavily and said that it was almost lunchtime and they should go together. She smiled and asked if they could have lunch together. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that of course because of the painting they could not finish talking. He looked at her intently and said that she was in love with someone after all. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked if they were not finished. He sighed heavily and said that of course they were not, as he still had many questions. Bastion sighed heavily and said that now he could ask them all a reason. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the king in surprise. She wondered if he really wanted to interrogate her. Sometime later, the princess and the king were sitting in the dining room and eating in silence. The princess looked closely at the king. She knew that he was going to interrogate her, but she did not understand why he was now sitting and eating silently. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the king, as this would make her even more afraid. She understood perfectly well that it was not too late to change the subject of the conversation. She looked closely at her brother and asked with a smile where he planned to place the portrait. He sighed heavily and said indifferently that it was none of her business. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and frowned, as she had not expected such an answer from him at all. She sighed as she knew that the conversation had failed to start, and the atmosphere had now become even worse. She looked closely at the king and asked what he thought of the lady they had met then. He looked at her intently and asked if she was talking about Lady Cecilia Montez. Clara smiled and said that it was exactly like that, and she thought the young lady was a very nice girl, and they could become friends with her. The king looked at his sister in surprise and sighed heavily, and said that she had no understanding of people at all, especially considering that she liked the prince. She sighed heavily, as he had said last time that she was very good at understanding people. She did not understand why the conversation had turned to the prince again. The king sighed quietly and asked his sister if the prince had enjoyed the tea party. She looked at him in surprise but said with a smile that he liked everything because he spoke well of the tea party. The king said that this was very good because he was planning to hold an official dinner soon. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. She asked if he already wanted to hold a dinner. She sighed heavily and looking at the king said that they had just held a public event. She was excited and did not understand why he suddenly wanted to hold a dinner. But in turn, she was a little glad. And recently she was very worried that the prince would not be able to leave the room again soon. She thought that this was a very good opportunity for the prince. The king sighed heavily and said that he was going to hold a dinner in the next few days, and she could convey this to the prince. A few minutes later he said that it was time for him to go. Clara looked at the king and said with a smile that she would pass on everything. As he was leaving, the king stopped abruptly and called his sister. She looked at her brother in bewilderment. He sighed heavily and said that she had been smiling all the time lately. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled. She did not know what his words meant. She wondered if he was making something up again. She wondered if he thought there was something between her and the prince again. She sighed heavily because she knew it was bad. Clara knew that she couldn't allow the same ending as in the novel. She understood perfectly well that she needed to urgently distance herself from the prince and keep her distance. The prince looked at the princess with a joyful smile and said that as she had said, the king had again allowed him to go out. The princess said in a distant voice that this was very good. The prince looked at the princess in bewilderment as he saw that she was not in the mood. Daniel looked closely at the princess and asked what happened to her as she looked very sad. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine and that it was time for them to go. The prince looked closely at the princess. He was excited by her sudden change. He looked closely at the princess because he knew that just a few days ago they had been chatting sweetly and smiling at each other, but now she seemed very distant to him. He looked closely at the princess and wondered if the king had told her something wrong. Of course, he knew perfectly well that the king was not the best person, but when he met him in person he changed his mind a little, but he just couldn't leave things as they were. He understood perfectly well that he needed to ask the king everything personally, but he didn't want the princess to know about it. The king sat quietly at the reception and watched everyone closely. He was very bored. The young man looked at his friend and said that they had been getting together often lately. He looked at his friend and asked if he had heard what had happened at tea since his wife had been there and had told him everything. The young people looked at each other, wondering if they would get into trouble for such conversations. A moment later, everyone present was informed that the princess and prince had arrived. The king of Prey looked at the prince with a satisfied grin on his face. The young lady slowly approached the king and greeted him with a smile. The king looked at the prince intently and said that they saw each other very often. The prince bowed humbly and thanked the king for the invitation. The king looked at him intently and said that he very much hoped he would have a great time. Daniel looked at the king intently but said nothing. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and said that there were a lot of unfamiliar dishes on the table. He asked the princess if she could help him. He showed her different dishes and asked about them. She came closer to him and began to tell about all the dishes. The king in turn quietly sipped wine and watched them. A moment later he looked at the prince with fury and called him. The king looked at the prince intently and said that they must now move away. The princess looked at the king with bewilderment and fear. She did not understand what he wanted from the prince now. She was taken aback and excitedly asked her brother where they were going. The king looked at his sister with anger and said that the prince had been living in their country for several months already. He looked at his sister with anger and asked if she really thought that he still needed her care. The prince was shocked and looking at the king shouted that he still needed her care. The king was shocked. He looked at the prince with anger and asked what he had just said. Daniel shouted angrily at the king that he himself did not understand the contradictory nature of his situation. The prince shouted at the king to release him and allow him to move freely, and then he would no longer need to rely on anyone. The king in turn shouted in rage and called the prince, and he threw the glass of wine on the ground and it shattered into pieces. The young lady was shocked. She understood that the king was very angry. She was puzzled and did not know what to do now. She was shocked and did not understand why he suddenly acted like this. The princess glanced sideways at Daniel, wondering if there was something she didn't know. The king looked at the prince with fury and shouted that he seemed to be a master of wagging his tongue. Looking at the prince, he asked whether if he let him go, he would no longer need Clara. The king shouted at the prince to know his place. The prince in turn looked intently at the king and said that at least not as much as now. The king looked at the prince with fury and asked if he really considered himself their guest. The king shouted to the prince that he was their hostage and he must understand this. Bastion was in shock. He wondered if hostages had the right to demand anything. He shouted at the prince that he was in the wrong position. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was perfectly aware of his position and that he was causing everyone inconvenience he knew. He said that the empire had never treated royalty like that under any circumstances. He said that he would ask permission to go out at least into the garden, and that's all because it was compatible with the palace. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that even this was too bold of him. She understood perfectly well that her brother would never agree to such a trick. Clara understood perfectly well that she had to stop this conversation because it would lead nowhere anyway. She stopped the prince with her hand and called her brother. The king looked at the prince with fury and asked if he even understood how he got there. The king shouted in fury that they had lost and fallen in their battle. The prince shouted to the king that he had attacked him with his knights, and he could not accept this as an honest defeat. The king was furious because Daniel did not know what boundaries were. Clara looked at her brother intently, and with an innocent smile said that she was very hungry. She asked if they could go to the table. The king looked at his sister with fury and anger and said that she should not even try to change the subject. He asked if she was still trying to protect the prince. The young lady was taken aback and said that she just wanted them all to enjoy the evening as everyone was really looking forward to this evening. She looked at everyone present and said that because of the two of them, no one could even breathe without fear. The king was furious. He shouted that he didn't care about it and he could easily throw everyone out. The young lady looked at her brother in confusion and asked why they had invited guests then. Looking at her brother, she said that he did not want to just scare them. The king froze in surprise for a moment as he did not expect such a question. She sighed heavily and said that she was afraid to even talk about it. She walked up to the prince and told him to stop. She looked at the prince intently and said that they understood him perfectly, but now was not the best time. She sighed heavily and said that she did not know why, but still the king had calmed down, and now it was not worth provoking him again. The princess looked at the prince intently and sighing heavily asked him to do it for her. Daniel sighed heavily but still agreed with the princess. She smiled and said that they could have a normal dinner. The young people were alarmed. They did not understand why the king was so calm, and they were afraid. Bastion was furious. He didn't understand how the prince even dared to look at Clara with such a face. He was furious, and it infuriated him. Bastion looked closely at the prince and said that it seemed he had many complaints against him. Bastion asked the prince if he wanted to continue. The princess shuddered at his words. She was shocked since he was back to his old ways. Clara came closer to the prince with lightning speed and asked if he was having fun. The prince looked at the princess with bewilderment, not knowing what to answer. Bastion looked closely at his sister and sighed heavily as he said that she was not his bodyguard at all, and that he had to answer for it himself. Daniel looked at the king intently and said in all seriousness that he wanted to challenge him to a duel. Clara was taken aback and froze in place from shock. Daniel looked at the king intently and said that if they were one-on-one, then he definitely would not lose. Daniel looked hard at the king and said that he very much hoped that the king would agree. Bastion jumped off the throne in anger, and looking at the prince said in anger that it seemed like he didn't see any boundaries at all. Bastion said angrily that he seemed to understand now what the prince had been thinking all this time. Clara was shocked because her brother started arguing again. She stood between them and called him. The king looked at the prince with a smirk and said that he accepted his challenge and they would fight one-on-one. Clara froze in shock as she had not expected anything like this at all. Daniel looked at the king and asked if he agreed. The king looked at the prince with a smirk and said that he would still win again and nothing would change. The king looked at the prince and said that if the prince wins, he will give him freedom, and if he loses, then it is clear what will happen to him. Bastion shouted furiously that they will still see who will win. The prince looked at the king intently and said with a grin that he had made a wise decision after all. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what had happened and how they had managed to turn dinner into a showdown. Clara looked at them in surprise and wondered if it was only she who saw this as a bolt from the blue. The king looked at everyone present and said that the duel would take place tomorrow, and that was all. He sighed heavily and said that it was time for him to leave, and therefore wished everyone a pleasant evening. The young lady was taken aback and looking at her brother shouted for him to wait. She did not understand where he was going. Clara screamed for him to stop and listen to her. The king looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she really wanted to say something. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She understood perfectly well that this situation was getting worse, and she did not know what to do to stop it. She looked at her brother intently and said that she did not know why he wanted this duel. Out of the blue, the king shouted that the scoundrel prince was constantly provoking him, and this idea with the prince's duel, the king shouted that he would then win again and shut him up forever. The young lady looked closely at her brother and said that she was very worried that he might get hurt in this duel. She looked at everyone present and asked if it could not be cancelled. The king looked at her with fury and asked if she really wanted him to ignore the challenge of the prince, the country they had defeated in war. The king shouted to his sister that she was worrying in vain because he would still win and show the puppy his place. The young lady froze in shock. She knew that this was the end and she had nothing more to add. She was in shock and did not understand why the king had to put the prince in his place. She asked him not to fight, but it was all in vain. She was furious, as if she had known that something like this would happen. She would have kept her mouth shut. The princess looked at the prince with fury. She understood that he did this on purpose. She slowly walked up to the prince and asked if he really wanted this battle. She sighed heavily and told the prince that she was also worried about him. The prince froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear something like this from the princess. A moment later, he sighed heavily and told the princess that she shouldn't worry because he wasn't going to lose either. The young lady was furious. She didn't understand what was wrong with them. She saw that they were both stubborn like donkeys. She was furious and didn't know who would win the duel and how it would end. She had learned their explosive nature and understood that they would both definitely go to the very end. She was worried because she knew that one of them might get hurt. She was worried that her brother might die in the duel. She knew that according to the novel, her death would immediately follow. The young lady was furious. She knew that this could not be allowed under any circumstances. She looked at them intently and said that they could fight in other ways. She sighed heavily and said, puzzled, that there was no need to immediately take up the sword. Clara said that there were many safe options, for example playing cards and so on. The king in turn looked at his sister with his rage. He did not understand what she was saying. He shouted that the most interesting thing in such duels is the blood of the enemy on his own sword. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the king since she did not even want to hear about such a thing. She thought for a moment, as she wanted to find a solution to this problem as quickly as possible. The young lady looked at the young men and asked, "How about archery?" The king and the prince looked at her in surprise. She smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and whoever hits the target more times will win. The prince smiled and said he liked that option. The king sighed heavily and said he didn't care because he was an excellent bowman. The young lady beamed with happiness but was glad that they both listened to her and agreed. She looked at them closely and asked if they agreed on archery. Clara smiled and said that it was much better than a sword duel. The king looked at his sister and said that he didn't care. The king looked at his sister and shouted that in exchange for his consent, she would be their judge. The young lady looked at the king in surprise as she had not expected this at all. He looked at her intently and said that it was her idea and that she should take responsibility. The king looked at the prince with fury and said that if he lost, he would not even be able to look out of his window. He said that he did not want to hear any more objections about this. As he left, he angrily told the prince to prepare immediately. The prince looked closely at the king and agreed with him. He sighed heavily and said that he must defeat the king. The young lady sighed heavily. She was in shock from what had happened. She understood that she had now avoided the worst scenario, but she was very excited because she did not know what would happen next. The maid looked happily at the princess and asked if there would really be a competition soon. The princess sighed heavily and said that the competition would be soon and she would have to be a judge at it. The maid looked at the princess with surprise and interest. She was interested in what had happened at the official dinner. The princess sighed heavily and said that everything had gone simply disgustingly, and unfortunately it was unlikely to be better in the future. The maid looked at the princess intently and asked if they could go with her as they wanted to support someone. The young lady looked at the maids in surprise and asked who they were rooting for. She asked if they really wanted to support the prince. The maids looked at the young lady intently and said that it was indeed so, but a moment later they stopped and said that of course they wanted to support the king. The maid smiled and said that in any case it was a good idea because the young lady would be able to change the score in someone's favor herself. The princess jumped up and said with a joyful smile that she could definitely do it. She looked closely at the maid and thanked her with a satisfied smile. She was in a very joyful mood because she could take the course of the competition in her hand. She knew that everything should go like clockwork. The next day everyone gathered to watch the competition. The lady stood quietly surrounded by a whole crowd. Everyone present shouted that their king would definitely win. Those present also did not forget about the prince and wished him good luck. The young lady in turn was very tense. She looked closely at everyone present and wondered if they had been too hasty. She was puzzled because the knights were training right now. The knights greeted the princess with a bright smile. She sighed heavily as she saw that there were too many people around, and she was already starting to worry. The king looked at the princess with a haughty grin and said with satisfaction that they were all here now to see him lose. Daniel looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that he believed she would judge them fairly. He looked at the princess intently and asked if she promised this. She, without raising her eyes, said that of course she promised this. The princess said that she was neutral, but unfortunately, this was her little lie, even though she was trembling all over with excitement. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she had to finish this duel without casualties, no matter what the cost. Sometime later they stood ready. All those present looked intently at the king and the prince and whispered among themselves. A moment later, the man announced that they were starting a competition between the king and the prince. The competition would be considered complete when all the arrows were used up. Everyone present wished both participants good luck. The prince looked at the king intently and said with a smile that he wanted to thank him again for agreeing to this daring request. He smiled and said that he very much hoped for a worthy game. The prince reached out to the king to shake his hand. The king angrily pushed the prince away. The king angrily asked the prince if he wanted to just shut his mouth, and that was it. The king shouted at the prince that he pissed him off every time he opened his mouth. He shouted that after this competition, the prince should not even dare to look in his direction. The prince froze in shock and bewilderment looking at the king. The young lady was shocked because she realized that they were arguing again. She looked closely at the young people and asked them to stop arguing because the competition would soon begin. The king looked at his sister with rage and shouted for her to announce the start of the competition. He did not understand why she was so slow. He asked if this was her first time as a judge. The princess froze in shock. She didn't expect this from her brother. She looked at the king with fury as she wanted to hit him once. She sighed heavily and looked at the young man with fury. She said that they could begin now. A moment later, the man announced the start of the competition. The king shot at the target with all his concentration. Everyone admired him and said that their king was as beautiful as ever. They couldn't stop admiring their king. He turned around with a joyful smile and said that it was just a trifle. The princess looked closely at the king. She saw that he had become very kind and fast. She was puzzled because she saw that this is what is called vanity. A moment later, she froze in surprise as she saw that the prince had hit his target. The man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they both hit the nail on the head. The man said with a smile that in the first round, the prince showed himself very well and was not inferior to the king at all. All the ladies present admired the prince, and they also shouted that the king and prince were simply very cool. The young lady looked at everyone present. She saw that there were a lot of spectators. She was very excited and confused because she just wanted to finish quietly and leave. She understood that now it would be very noisy here until the very end. The prince looked intently at the king with a radiant smile on his face. The prince's behavior made the king very angry, and he pulled the bowstring sharply. The king shouted angrily that the prince was simply impudent. But despite all the anger and fury, the king hit the target. The prince in turn did not lag behind the king and also hit the target. The man said with a smile that they had hit the mark. The young lady looked at the young men intently. She saw that they were both very handsome, and she looked at them as everything was clear without a judge. The young people kept whispering. They saw that the prince and the king were very good with the bow. The king was furious and shouted to everyone present to stop making noise. The king looked at the prince intently and said that he recognized his skills. He sighed heavily and said that apparently he was wrong to look down on his education. The prince looked at the king in surprise and thanked him for such words. He said that he never thought he would ever receive his approval. The king looked at the prince in surprise and said that this was nonsense. The king angrily told the prince that he was not that good anyway. The prince looked at him in bewilderment. The king shouted at the prince that even if he acknowledged his skills, it would not change anything. He shouted that he would still win. The princess looked at her brother with a smile and shouted that he had hit the target again. The king looked angrily at his sister and shouted that he actually saw it himself because his eyes were in place. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. She did not understand why he was shouting again. She looked at her brother closely and wondered if this sudden change was all because of the prince. She sighed heavily as she could not do anything. She looked closely at the scoreboard because she saw that everything was leading to a draw for now. She understood that if everything continued like this in the future, then it could be said that they had avoided all dangers. She looked at them closely and with a happy smile said that they were doing very well and also wished them luck. She hoped that everything would end like this. The knights looked at the prince intently. They were surprised and did not expect that he had such skills. They said that even though he was a prisoner, he again showed very good skills. The knight commander looked at the young knights with fury and shouted that for this reason they needed to study seriously. The young men were taken aback. The commander shouted that they must work for the good of the king and country. They asked for forgiveness and quickly got to work. The commander looked closely at the newcomer and said that he must do everything without mistakes. The young man sighed heavily. He knew that unfortunately he had missed the mark when he had been distracted by the princess. He understood that he could not make such mistakes in front of others in the future. He slowly pulled the bowstring but still glanced sideways at the princess. He knew that there were rumors that she was very beautiful, and he was amazed because he did not expect her to be so beautiful. He saw her beautiful violet eyes. He hoped that at least someday he would be able to look into them. He looked forward shyly. The captain looked at the newcomer with fury and asked if he had gone mad. He shouted at him to watch where he was shooting. The young man in turn became distracted and let go of the bowstring. The young knight froze in shock along with the captain. A moment later, the knight excitedly shouted to the prince and Ace to be careful. She turned around in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The young lady froze in shock when she saw that she was urinating an arrow. The young lady in turn stood frozen in place, stunned. She was shocked that an arrow was flying towards her. She wondered if this was how she would die. The young lady was furious. She wondered if she was going to die again. She was puzzled because she now realized that since her rebirth as Clara, she had not done anything yet. The young lady was furious. She didn't want to die at all. She closed her eyes and hoped that someone would save her. But a moment later, the arrow that was flying straight at her head was cut in half with one swing. With the speed of lightning, the prince rushed to the princess. He excitedly asked if she was okay. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock. She glanced sideways at the prince and called out to him. But a moment later, she staggered and began to fall, and the prince rushed towards her with lightning speed. The king, in turn, also ran up to his sister. He shouted and called her. The king was puzzled. He looked closely at his sister and called out if she was hurt. He was very worried and wanted to know how she was feeling. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was fine. The prince looked at her closely and asked if everything was really fine. Clara said that she was fine, but she was very scared because she thought that she was about to die. The prince looked at the young lady and said that he thought she had slightly dislocated her shoulder, and he thought she needed to be examined by a doctor. She sighed heavily and said that she did not need anything, and she would just go to her room. The king looked at everyone present with anger. He was angry and did not know who did it. He looked at everyone with anger and asked who dared to shoot at the royal family. The prince, with the speed of lightning, pointed out to the king from which direction the arrow had come. The young man was taken aback, and trembling said that it was him. The captain quickly stood up for his knight. He said that he wanted to ask for forgiveness, because it was he who failed to train the knight properly. He shouted that it was his fault. The king in turn was furious. He shouted that in that case both heads would fly. He shouted that he didn't care who was really guilty. He shouted that they should be seized immediately. The young man asked for forgiveness with tears in his eyes. The princess looked at her brother and said that the young knight did not do it on purpose, and it was just an accident. The king looked at his sister with fury and shouted that she almost died. He asked if she didn't understand that. She sighed heavily, not knowing what to answer. The young lady did not want anyone to die at all. She sighed heavily and told her brother that it was not at all necessary to be so harsh with other people's lives. She slowly bowed in that direction. The prince looked at the princess with excitement and called her. He looked at the princess closely and said that she had been through a great shock, and he thought she had better call the oak doctor. He examined her. She sighed heavily and said that she did not need that at all. The king pushed the prince away with anger, and abruptly, he quickly approached his sister. With lightning speed, he took his sister in his arms. She screamed involuntarily, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady looked at her brother with embarrassment and called out that she could go herself. He looked at her intently and said that she should just rest in the door, and he would call a doctor to have her examined. He looked at the knights and told them to put those two in prison until the verdict was passed. He said that they should lock the prince in a room. The prince was in shock. He called the king, but it was all in vain. The prince froze in surprise. He was very worried and wanted to help the princess. The princess sighed heavily and sheepishly told her brother that she was perfectly fine. Closing herself from prying eyes, she said that she was a little ashamed and asked him to let her go. He looked at the princess in surprise and said that she was a princess herself, and he did not understand in front of whom she should be ashamed. With lightning speed, he burst into the room and told the servants to call a doctor immediately. He looked at the maid intently and told her to hurry up. He also told them to quickly prepare a bed for the princess. The maids rushed to work with lightning speed. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was perfectly fine. She was confused as she was a little scared of possible death, but she knew that all the fuss around was even worse. She sighed heavily as she just wanted to go home. The doctor looked at the king and said that the princess was fine, and there were no problems with her health. The king looked at the doctor with anger and asked if he was sure of his words. He shouted that for such a mistake he could be incarnated with his head. The king looked at the maids with fury and shouted at them to watch over the princess while he went away. The maids shouted that they would certainly do everything. The princess looked at her brother in surprise and asked where he was going. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted to visit the prisoners in prison. A moment later, the king looked closely at his sister and called her. Clara looked at her brother in bewilderment. The king sighed heavily and asked his sister for forgiveness in all seriousness. He turned away from his sister and said that he should never have taken her to the competition. He was puzzled and said that this all happened because of him. He said that it was entirely his fault. With lightning speed, the young lady rose and looked at her brother intently and with surprise. She was surprised and did not understand why he was asking her for forgiveness. She sighed heavily because she did not understand him at all. She understood that this only made her more afraid. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was looking at him like that. He shouted that she should lie down because at any moment she could become ill. Clara looked at her brother with a smile and said that she was fine and she could sit up. She looked at him with a joyful smile because despite all his oddities, he cared about her. He shouted because he didn't understand what kind of expression she had on her face. He shouted that she should quickly go to bed. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with him. With lightning speed, she did what he ordered her. He shouted that he was going to leave now, but she shouldn't even get up. She sighed heavily and agreed with him. She understood that he was always his own man, and it was difficult to understand him. Considering his changes in mood, for a moment he remembered how the prince quickly reacted and shot straight at the target. Thus he saved the princess from death. The king looked sideways at his sister and said that he would grant freedom to the prince. The king said that for now he could only go out into the garden, but he was going to send him away so that he would not bother her anymore. The young lady in turn indifferently agreed with him. A moment later, she understood what was being said. She quickly rose and looking at her brother asked what he had just said. She looked at him intently and asked in surprise if she had heard everything correctly. She was shocked and did not understand why he did not drive him away because he did not lose. The king sighed heavily and said that the outcome of the torture was not so important, but he still could not ignore the prince's action. He told his sister that she should not worry because he was doing what he should. Clara was shocked because the king changed his mind very quickly. She simply refused to understand him. She looked closely at her brother, wondering if maybe he was the one who was sick and not her. The princess looked at her maid in surprise and asked if the prince had really saved her. The maid smiled and said that it was true. She said with a joyful smile that the prince literally drew his bow in a matter of moments and shot to save her. She said that the prince was very good with the bow and they were all very surprised. The maid-sir said with a joyful smile that at first she did not want to go there, but her friends still called her, and she was very glad that she could see this magnificent moment. She smiled and said that the prince was very cool. The princess looked at the maid in surprise and asked if he really did it. She was puzzled because she couldn't see anything because she had closed her eyes in fear. The maid smiled and said that she was just so amazed because everything happened so quickly, and she couldn't believe how he managed to save the princess. The lady was surprised. She did not understand how he managed to hit that arrow because it was already in front of her eyes. Now she understood why her brother freed the prince. Of course, she knew that the king treasured Clara and her life was in danger. She sighed heavily because she knew that everything ended with the prince being freed and no one was hurt. She was glad because there was very little time left. The man looked at the princess intently and asked for forgiveness for calling her to such a place. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine and also asked how long she had to go. The man said that they were almost there and His Majesty was already waiting for her. After walking some distance, the young lady clearly saw the king in front of her. The king looked at her intently. The young man shouted and called the princess with tears in his eyes. She was taken aback as she had not expected to see anything like this. The king looked intently at the young man and asked how he wished to die. The young man with tears in his eyes begged to spare him just as he had done by accident. She looked at him in surprise and asked why they shot the bodies right at her. The young man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. He sighed heavily and said with tears in his eyes that he had simply been looking at her while holding the bow and had accidentally let go of the string. He looked at the princess intently and said that she was very beautiful. She froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The king looked at the young man with anger and asked him if this was his excuse. He shouted at the knight that he had little time. As it was, he did not understand what nonsense he was talking about. The knight, with tears in his eyes, said that it was true. He asked him to believe him. The king screamed in rage that he did not want to listen to this anymore. He shouted to his subordinates to bring the young man out immediately to execution. The knight, with tears in his eyes, asked the princess to have mercy on him. The princess looked at her brother and said that they could pardon the knight. The king froze in shock. He looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she was really asking to save the knight's life. The princess said that she was alive and everything was fine. The king was furious and he did not understand how she could believe the knight. He shouted that this was complete nonsense. The young lady looked at the king intently and said with a smile that he himself knew that there was no point in killing her because she had no power or influence. The king was taken aback and was shocked by this. The young lady sighed heavily and said that besides, if he really did it by accident, then killing him would be a mistake. She said that since she could really get hurt, he deserves to be imprisoned. She looked at the young man intently as she thought that this was the right judgment of her side. Trembling with fear and shedding tears, the young man thanked the princess. The king looked at her with fury and asked if she was just glad that he called her beautiful. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't care at all what he thought of her. The king looked at the young man with fury and shouted that he should know that he was only alive because of the kindness of the princess. He shouted at the young man that he would rot in prison for years. The king shouted that he would leave the rest to the judge. He looked sideways at his sister and said that they must go, for they had no more time to waste on such rubbish. When leaving prison, the king told his sister not to let anyone get away with anything anymore. He said that royal blood flows in her and she must gain confidence. The young lady looked after her brother in surprise, and a moment later she thanked him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she thanked him for supporting her and for having the courage to let the prince go. He sighed heavily and, looking at his sister, said that he was afraid she had misunderstood him. He said that of course he was grateful to the prince behind her for saving her, but still it was not complete freedom. He said that he would always be followed by guards wherever he went. The king said with a grin that he had one more important matter. She was surprised, looked at him and asked what she was talking about. He smiled and said that she didn't need to put that out of her mind at all. The young lady looked at brother in bewilderment as she didn't understand what he was talking about. Sometime later she was walking slowly through the garden. She was a little puzzled, as she did not know what her brother meant. A moment later she heard the prince greet her and turned around in surprise. She froze in surprise as she saw the prince with some kind of tool in his hands. She shuddered and called the prince with lightning speed. With the speed of lightning she ran up to the prince. She was surprised and did not understand what he was doing there. The prince smiled and said that the king had allowed him to leave the room and take care of the garden for an hour. Clara looked at the prince in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. She was furious as she did not understand where she had ever seen the main character of a novel sweeping a path in a garden. She looked closely at the young man because she understood that he was a prince. She sighed heavily because now she understood perfectly well why her brother had smiled sarcastically back then. She sighed heavily as she realized that everyone in this family was the same. Claire did not want the young prince to have to deal with such treatment. The prince said with a happy smile that it was the first time he had cleaned the garden and it was very interesting and fun. Daniel smiled and said that what he was most happy about was being able to go outside. He smiled and told the princess to convey his gratitude to the king. She was surprised that he was happy. But she was more surprised that the prince had carefully cleaned everything up and the garden had become beautiful. She sighed heavily because she saw that the most important thing was that he liked it. She understood that he had adapted to everything very quickly. The prince looked closely at the princess and with a joyful smile said that she would turn out to be completely fine, and he was very glad about it. He said that he was very worried about her, and he hoped that everything would be fine with her, without any consequences. She looked at the prince and said that he had no need to worry at all and that she should be thanking him now. She said that she had been told that it was he who had saved her back then. He smiled and said that he had only done what anyone else would have done in his place. The prince looked closely at the young princess and said that the king was very worried about her. Daniel noticed that they were very close to each other. The young lady looked closely at the prince and with a joyful smile said that everything was exactly so because they were brother and sister. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he understood her. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if it was strange for him to value his family members. Clara smiled and said that she would very much like her brother to live happily ever after because he was her only blood relative now. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and said that the king was happy to hear this. Clara looked at Daniel intently and asked him not to quarrel with the king anymore. For this reason, she sighed heavily and said that she did not want anyone to get hurt at all. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked who she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she was talking about both of them now. Daniel looked at her intently as he now understood why she had discouraged them from fighting with swords. She sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and her brother should live for a very long time. She understood perfectly well that in that case she would live with him. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if she was afraid that he would kill him. The young lady was taken aback and shouted at the prince not to say such words even as a joke. She said that he should understand perfectly well what happens for such words. He smiled and said that she should not worry since he did not want that at all. The princess looked at the prince intently and pouting asked if this was true because it was very important to her. He sighed heavily and said that he had absolutely no idea how to make her believe his words. He looked at the princess with a smile and extended his hand to her. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise as she did not understand why he suddenly extended his hand to her, but she nevertheless extended her hand to him in response. Daniel in turn tenderly kissed the princess's hand. He looked closely at the princess and with a radiant smile said that with this kiss he was giving her a promise. He smiled and asked if she believed him now. She froze in shock on the spot, as she did not expect such a thing. Her heart was beating very hard in her chest. She was surprised because he kissed her hand very suddenly. Clara was a little puzzled. She didn't know how to react to something like that. The maids looked at each other with joyful smiles. They saw that the princess was very surprised. A moment later they noticed that there was a prince next to the princess. The maid screamed and called the princess. The young lady was taken aback and came to reality. She quickly let go of the prince's hand and said that she had to go. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that her maids must have something urgent. She looked at him with a smile and quickly said goodbye and asked for forgiveness. The young lady quickly turned around and ran away. She was shocked and wondered what to do. She did not understand why she was so red. She was very excited and confused as she could not even answer the prince clearly. The maid looked at the princess excitedly and greeted her and also asked what they were talking about with the prince. She was worried that they might disturb her. Clara was taken aback and said that they were not talking about anything so important, and also asked why they called out to her. The maid said that they just wanted to greet her. A moment later, they began to engage in casual conversation among themselves. The princess was surprised by their conversation, and the maids giggled playfully. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and wondered if this was her urgent business. He looked at her closely as he saw that she got along very well with the maids and smiled at them constantly. He knew that at first glance she had appeared very cold and wary, but now he understood perfectly well why the king cared so much about his sister. He knew perfectly well that he would never find such a sweet little sister anywhere else. He sighed heavily as he would very much like the relationships in his family to be the same. With the speed of lightning, he ran to his brother and asked why he was behaving like this with him. Daniel was agitated and asked his brother if he had done something wrong. The prince looked at his younger brother with fury. Daniel trembled with fear. The prince looked at his brother with fury and asked if he was really a complete fool or just pretending. He asked angrily if he didn't remember what happened at dinner. The emperor looked at Daniel intently and said with a smile that he was well trained, and these were excellent qualities for a future ruler. The young man shouted that his father was comparing them again. He shouted that he was the future ruler, not Daniel. He shouted furiously at his brother to stop pretending to be stupid and hide behind a smile. He shouted at his brother that he was behaving just like he did with his mother back then. He shouted at Daniel that all he knew was how to plot behind his back. Daniel was shocked. He didn't expect to hear anything like that addressed to him. He looked at his brother intently and called out to him. The prince looked at Daniel with fury and grabbed him by the clothes, shouting that he never thought of him as his brother. He shouted that he was just pretending in front of his father, that everything was fine between them. With lightning speed, he pushed Daniel away and shouted at him not to show his face again if his life was so dear to him. Daniel was in shock. He wasn't striving for the throne at all, and he didn't care about power. He just wanted his brother to recognize him. Daniel, in turn, wondered if his brother would be happy when he found out that he was alive. He wondered if there was anyone waiting for him in the empire. The men whispered among themselves as they had come to a consensus. The king looked at all those present and sighed heavily and said that he was very glad that they had come to a unanimous decision. He said that they could consider their trial to be over. Everyone present was very surprised and glad that everything ended so quickly. They wanted to quickly return home and rest. A moment later, the king said that there was something else that they had to decide. The king looked at everyone present and said that he planned to give Palace to Clara. He looked at them all and asked what they thought about it. For a moment, there was complete silence in the hall. They were surprised that the king wanted to give the princess lands. They looked at each other because they knew that the princess had never ruled the land, but they were not worried and did not know what could happen under her rule. They knew that the territory was very small, but they were still afraid that the princess might not cope. The king looked at everyone present with fury and said that they must finish their sentences. He asked angrily if they really doubted the princess of their country so much. Everyone present was taken aback and said that they did not doubt her at all. The king looked at everyone present with his rage and asked what the problem was. Then he shouted that they should answer him already, because it was just land. He looked at them with cold fury and said that if they had nothing more to add, then everything was decided. A moment later, a man entered the office and told the king that he had brought the documents he had asked for. Everyone present was in shock as they did not understand what documents were being discussed. A moment later, the king sighed heavily and said that these were documents for the transfer of land to his sister. A moment later, he signed them and said that they now definitely belonged to his sister. The princess looked at her brother in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The king sighed heavily while drinking tea and said that he had given her a small but rich territory, and there was even a forest there. Looking at his sister, he said that she would definitely like it there. The young lady was taken aback. She said that it was too raw on his part. She sighed heavily and hesitating said that he had given her land. She was puzzled because she had nothing before. The king shouted angrily that this was the whole problem. The king was furious. He did not understand where it was seen that he was a princess did not have his own property. He shouted that even a beggar tramp had more property than she. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant by that. He sighed heavily and said that she should just accept it as a gift, and that was all. The young lady looked at the king intently and sighing heavily. I said that she really wasn't sure. She said that she understood everything, but she didn't know how to manage lands, and it seemed very burdensome. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was worried. He shouted that someone had looked after the land before her. He shouted that he would help her in everything. The king looked closely at his sister and said that he had already signed all the documents, so there should be no refusals from her. The young lady looked at the king in surprise as she had not expected this at all. A moment later, she froze in surprise as she noticed that the documents had indeed been signed. She realized that it looked as if she had no choice. The king sighed heavily and said that since they had talked about everything he would go, he said that when the weather was fine, they could go there together. The young lady jumped up from her chair and asked her brother to wait a little. Clara stood frozen in surprise as he walked away, leaving her alone. She was surprised and did not understand why he forced her to accept the salt, a precious gift. She was surprised because he gave her the land out of the blue. She knew it was very strange for a princess to have no land of her own, but she was surprised that he didn't even ask her about it. She sighed heavily because she understood that since he had granted her land, she would gladly accept this gift. She understood that her head was filled with other problems anyway, and she should not worry about this. She knew that despite the fact that the reception had not gone very well, it could be said that their duel had ended in a way that was beneficial to everyone, and that the prince had even received some freedom. She hoped that nothing else would happen. The maid looked closely at the young mistress and asked with a smile what she was thinking about. The princess smiled and said that she didn't think anything like that. Looking at the maid, she said that she looked very happy. She wanted to know what happened. The maid smiled and said that today was just a nice day. The maid smiled and said that it was probably because of the weather. She said that on days like these, one should definitely go on picnics. The young lady looked out the window and noticed that today was indeed a nice day. Sometime later, the prince stood in the library and looked closely at the books. But a moment later he was taken aback. He was surprised as the princess of the Mace Library. He looked at her intently and surprised and asked why she was here. The young lady was surprised as she just wanted to take a book and did not expect to see the prince at all. She sighed heavily as she still felt awkward looking into his eyes after he had tenderly kissed her hand. She smiled and said that she simply loved to read, and that was why she often came to the library. She looked at him intently and asked if he also loved reading. The prince smiled and said that he did, and that was the reason he had come to the library right after cleaning. He smiled and said that he was very glad to meet the princess in such a place. She came closer to him and asked him with a smile what book he was reading. He smiled and said that he had decided to read a book about the history and politics of the kingdom. He said that in his homeland there were also many similar books, but he would like to read something about her country. He looked closely at the princess and said that he had learned a lot of new things for himself. She looked at the prince intently because she knew that he was simply magnificent as a person. She always chose only novels from the library. She was a little puzzled because she had always offered him novels to read when he was locked up. She, of course, was not ashamed, but now she felt awkward. The prince looked at the princess in surprise and asked what books she liked. She sighed heavily, as she understood perfectly well that she could not say anything about the books she had read in her past life. She was taken aback and timidly said that she liked Basil's book. The prince looked at the princess intently and said that he was a very good author, and he had also recently read his books. The princess was surprised and could not believe him, and the like. She was surprised that they even had the same tastes. He looked at her with a smile and said that when she mentioned the author, he suddenly wanted to reread his books. He smiled and said that he thought they should look at other strong men. The young lady looked at the prince and said that they could just ask the librarian. She froze for a moment in surprise as she realized that he was very fast. She quickly lost him. A moment later, the princess looked up and saw a book by her favorite author. She sighed heavily and reached for the book, but unfortunately, it was too high. She thought that she should call the librarian after all. Looking around, she saw a small staircase not far from her. She was glad that the ladder was nearby, and now she could get the book herself without anyone's help. The princess reached for the book. She knew that in a little while she would be able to get the book. Her legs were shaking, but she was still glad that she had managed to get the book. But unfortunately, a moment later, her foot slipped off the ladder. Because her foot slipped, she lost her balance. She was very excited because she realized that she was simply falling to the ground. A few minutes later, she finally realized that she had fallen, but she was still somewhat confused as she had not felt any pain when she fell. She timidly opened one eye. For a moment, she froze in surprise. The prince looked closely at the princess and said that she should have called him and not climbed the stairs herself. He moved closer to her and looking into their eyes asked if she was okay. Clara froze in place in embarrassment. She was in shock as he came too close to her. With lightning speed, she pulled away from him and said that she was fine, and the young lady also asked if he himself was okay. He looked at the princess in surprise and said that he was fine. Clara came closer to him. She was alarmed because she saw that he had caught a falling man. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was okay, because she was not heavy at all. Clara looked at Daniel intently and with a radiant smile thanked him. Daniel smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for at all. Daniel looked at the princess intently and said that he was very glad that she was not hurt. As if she had been, he would have had to apologize to the king personally. Daniel looked at the princess with a puzzled expression and said that the king would probably be very angry and lock him in the room again. He said that for this reason he should be the one thanking her. She sighed heavily because she knew that the king was quite capable of such a thing. She sighed heavily because she just wanted them to get closer. Clara looked into the distance and called the prince. She quickly turned around and, looking at the prince with a smile, asked if he wanted to go on a picnic together. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to go on a picnic with her and the king. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she wanted it. The prince said that he thought the queen would not like this idea. She smiled and said that he had been in their kingdom for a long time and she would like them to become friends. She looked at the police, said that if he agreed, she would try to convince him. The prince said that he himself would not mind if their relationship improved. He hesitated, not knowing what to answer the princess. The princess looked at him intently and asked if he could go for her. He froze in shock as he didn't expect anything like this at all, but a moment later he looked at her with confusion. He looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that he agreed and that he relied on her very much. The king looked at his sister and said that it was a very good idea on her part to go on a picnic, but he did not understand why she had invited the prince. She smiled and said that if they became friends it would be very wonderful. The king screamed with rage. He did not understand why he should be friends with the prince at all. She looked at her brother intently and said that once the prince returned to his home, they could establish political and diplomatic relations between the countries. The king was furious. He shouted that they could have gone just the two of them. He shouted that he had already given the prince too much freedom. The princess looked at her brother and said that he should not speak like that. She touched his hand tenderly. She said that they could always ride together, but for the prince, this was the only chance. She smiled and said that the prince did not have much time left to live in their kingdom, which meant they needed to use the remaining opportunity. The king looked at his sister and called her. He was shocked. He did not understand why she suddenly grabbed his hand. He was confused. She looked at him and shouted that he must allow it. She smiled and said that she wanted the prince to speak well of their kingdom when he returned home. She spent some time persuading him. He looked at his sister with embarrassment and said that he would definitely think about it, and also asked her to let go of his hand. She looked at him intently and asked if he promised her. He shouted that she must let him go. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked how much longer she would call him brother. He sighed heavily and said that he agreed, but still asked his sister not to think that he was doing this for the prince. She smiled and said that she understood this. He looked at her sharply and said that in that case, he would set a date for the picnic when he checked his schedule. He said that she could tell the prince that. He sighed heavily and said that he really hoped the weather would be good then. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect him to agree so easily. She looked closely at her brother as she thought he would refuse to the last. She thought that he had become more gentle lately. The young lady looked intently out the window and enjoyed the scenery. The king looked at her in surprise and asked, who was going to see this? She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she had not left the castle for a long time. She was amazed by the beauty of the streets because it was the first time she was outside the capital. The king looked at his sister intently and asked if she wanted to step outside for a minute. He said that no one here knew them by sight anyway, so they could walk around freely. She smiled and said that of course she really wanted to go for a walk. The young lady looked at all the townspeople intently. She was amazed. The king looked at her intently and asked if she really liked it so much. She smiled at him radiantly and said that of course she liked it here very much. He looked at her intently and said with a soft smile that it was very good. The prince looked at the young people in surprise and asked where they were going. The king, with the speed of lightning, embraced the princess, and looking at the prince, asked him with hostility what difference it made to him where they were going. The princess sighed heavily and told her brother that they had come here together. The king looked at the prince with anger and asked what was so unclear, since they had just decided to walk down the street. He said that they could buy something for the princess if she liked it. He looked at her intently and asked where she would like to go. She looked at him in surprise as she thought they would just go for a walk. A moment later, the king shouted that they must definitely go to the most expensive place. The princess was taken aback and shouted to her brother she was puzzled and did not understand whether he heard her or not. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't need any decorations. She was in shock and didn't understand why their walk had turned into a trip to a jewelry store. The young lady looked out the window in surprise. She was puzzled and did not understand why the prince did not come inside. The king looked at his sister with a grin and said that the prince couldn't buy anything anyway, and so he didn't see why he should go into the store at all.